Mira Carter had always been caught in the pull between the mundane and the mystical, though she had never truly believed in the stories whispered around her hometown. Sequestered at the edge of towering evergreens and shrouded ravines, her little town wore its supernatural lore on its sleeve. Old folks would spin yarns of howling creatures under a full moon, and younger ones would gossip about mysterious claw marks left on fence posts. As a child, she had treated those tales with the excited gullibility that only came with innocence, but as she'd grown older, she tucked them away like bedtime stories meant to give kids a thrill. Yet deep down, perhaps some part of her had always believed there was a hint of truth hidden within those half-serious legends. Sometimes she'd catch a glimpse of a large silhouette weaving through the moonlit trees, or she'd notice footprints too big and too strangely shaped to be from any ordinary wolf. And always, she'd feel that surge of adrenaline, that inexplicable rush of certainty that something larger, something grander, prowled in the shadows of her quiet world. This sense of existing on the fringes of something extraordinary became more pronounced as she got older. She'd hear rumors about the lunar eclipse pack, though no one spoke their name loudly. They were an unspoken fact of the place, an undercurrent beneath everyday life. Some insisted the pack was a group of off-the-grid survivalists who thrived in the forest, but others, older folk with glinting eyes, would warn in low voices about their fierce protectiveness, their supernatural speed and strength, their distinctly wolfish eyes. Yet even those who believed seemed content to let the pack be, quietly respecting a boundary they weren't sure how to cross. After all, legends were best left as they were, lurking at the periphery of the known world. Mira never thought she'd be anything more than a spectator to these legends. She'd done well for herself, graduated high school, worked at the local bookstore for some years, then took over as manager when Ms. Haley retired. Life in a small town was predictable, the kind of existence many people yearned to escape, but Mira found a quiet satisfaction in every hour spent among shelves of novels and ancient histories. She liked finding patterns in words, in stories, an odd reflection of the things she sometimes sensed stirring beyond the veil of normal. She often told herself she'd never trade her slow, steady routine for anything else. Then, on a crisp, late autumn afternoon, everything changed. The day started simply enough. Soft leaves scattered across the sidewalks as she walked from her small home to the bookstore, humming to herself with half her mind on inventory logs and the other half on a new fantasy series she was planning to read. She had no idea that even then, under the auburn light of the fading day, the town's whispers were no longer just idle speculation, but a drumbeat that would soon reverberate through her life. Rumors circulated that Alpha Kieran, the leader of the Lunar Eclipse Pack, had returned to the area after spending a length of time traveling beyond the territory. A few residents whispered that he had visited neighboring packs, forging alliances or settling old disputes that didn't concern the small human community. Others said he had gone to train, to harness greater powers. The details were unclear, even contradictory, but one thing was certain. With his return, there would be a grand tradition to uphold. Every century so the legend went this pack chose their alpha differently from others. Rather than the typical expectation of a fated mate that was sometimes whispered about in werewolf lore, the alpha in the Lunar Eclipse Pack performed the rite of the blood moon. For them, it was an event of reverence and necessity, a time when the alpha's leadership was reaffirmed, their power recognized by the pack. And in that same breath, the alpha must choose a mate from among the she-wolves who aligned with the pack. It sounded archaic and old-fashioned, a spectacle from a time when alliances were sealed by arranged unions and traditions were etched in stone. Yet, as the day wore on and as Mira rang up books and fielded half-hearted rumors from customers, she grew uneasy. There was something about the mention of that Alpha's Kieran that prickled at her senses, a tingle in the air that told her the fabric of her neatly ordered life was about to be unraveled. She had never met Kieran, never so much as glimpsed him, but she recognized the hush that fell whenever his name was spoken. He was said to be formidable, exuding raw power, quicksilver reflexes, and an intensity that matched the stormy forests he ruled. People claimed the color of his eyes was impossible to describe without falling into poetry. Some said they were as gold as wildfire, others that they were the green of pine forests at midnight. All who spoke of him agreed on one point. He was powerful and untamed, his will forging the direction of the pack like iron. When Mira lapped up that evening and wandered home, the autumn chill felt sharper, the night somehow darker. She sensed she was being watched, but when she glanced over her shoulder, she only saw the familiar shapes of parked cars and street lamps illuminating empty sidewalks. Shaking off a surge of nerves, she hurried inside, bolting the door. She scolded herself for her jittery imagination. Still, she found it hard to sleep. She woke the next morning feeling restless, the sense of looming change pressing her chest like a phantom weight. She went to the bookstore as usual, but her concentration was fraught. She fumbled with the keys, almost dropped a cup of tea, couldn't focus on the spreadsheets. By midday, she'd abandoned the idea of being productive and sought refuge in the corner of the store that held mythology and folklore, skimming through sections about wolves, reading more about pack structures, superstitions regarding blood moons, and their significance to shapeshifters. Each word she read made her heart beat faster. Legends said that if the Alpha did not secure a mate by the rising of the blood moon, the pack's unity would fracture, and leadership would be compromised, leaving them vulnerable to rival packs. She read about the power that the chosen mate wielded, how the bond with an Alpha could be as strong and inescapable as a raging current. She couldn't say why she spent hours devouring these pieces of mythology, why each sentence pulled her deeper into an inexplicable dread or excitement. By the time she closed the bookstore that evening, she felt unaccountably tired, as though she'd run a marathon in her mind. The night once again seemed too quiet, too still, a hush that made her footsteps sound loud on the sidewalk. She'd almost reached her home when the presence of someone standing beneath the flickering porch light startled her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark leather jacket that caught the glow of the lamp. His hair was midnight black, with faint hints of silver that could have been just the reflection of the light or the suggestion of something unearthly. Mira stopped, heart pounding. The man looked up, and she saw, for the first time, eyes that glowed with an indescribable color, somewhere between gold and green, mesmerizing in their intensity. It had to be him. There was no doubt in her mind. Kieran, the Alpha. She expected him to speak, to say anything, but he merely gazed at her, an assessing look that made her feel as though she was being weighed for strengths and weaknesses she hadn't even realized she possessed. "Your name is Mira." His voice was deep, resonant, a quiet command that seemed to ripple with a wolf's growl at the edges. It wasn't a question. She swallowed. Yes. He nodded once, a motion of acknowledgement. Up close, the power radiating off him was almost tangible, like standing close to an open fire. For a moment, all she could do was stare, transfixed by the realization that the legends were not just real, they were standing on her doorstep. "Listen," she began, forcing her voice steady. "I don't know why you're here, but if you're looking for me specifically, I think you should. There's no time to waste," he said, still in that measured, rich tone that brooked no. Argument. I know this must seem sudden, but I've made a choice that will reshape everything. Her confusion must have been plain because the corner of his mouth twitched in a faint, wry expression. I'm Alpha Kieran of the Lunar Eclipse Pack. You may have heard some version of our tradition. The rite of the blood moon demands that I choose a mate from among the she-wolves of my pack before the blood moon rises, but I haven't chosen any of them. His gaze flicked over her face, his eyes shining with certainty. I've chosen you. For a long moment, the world stopped spinning. Mira stared, thunderstruck. The words made no sense. She was humane and ordinary human with no extraordinary gifts, no connection to the pack, and he was an alpha, the rumored apex predator among werewolves. She tried to dismiss the notion as an absurd joke, but the look in his eyes defied that possibility. He was utterly serious. That's not possible, she managed after a moment that felt like a year. I'm no time not one of you. I don't know anything about your world. Kieran inclined his head in acceptance of her argument. I'm aware, and I also know what my pack will say. This breaks centuries of tradition, but what's done is done. His voice was quieter then, but underlined with steel. I don't make choices lightly, Mira Carter, and I don't change them once they're made. She stared in open disbelief. But me, we've never even met. A flicker of something regret, maybe illumined in his gaze. Not in the way you think, but I've watched you from afar, learned who you are. There's a presence about you. You stand on the cusp of the supernatural world, refusing to yield to fear or ignorance. You carry an open mind, a willingness to see past illusions and accept the truth. Even if you didn't believe wholly in us, some part of your soul never turned away from the pred. Possibility. And I? He paused, as though weighing his next words. I can feel a pull toward you, a resonance that refuses to let me choose another. Mira's head spun. She couldn't reconcile the quiet bookstore manager she was in the daytime with the focal point of such intense attention. This is too much, she whispered. This is insane. Perhaps, he allowed with a faint shrug. But it's done. You will be my mate. My pack expects me to formalize the arrangement by the next blood moon, which is a month away. I want to ease you into this, but time is of the essence. Ease me into this? She echoed, voice sharp with disbelief. You're telling me you've basically decided my life path for me, and you say there's no time to talk it over, no time to ask if I even want this? Anger and panic flared, fueled by shock. Absolutely not. I'm a human, not some possession to be chosen at your whim. You can't just show up on my doorstep and claim me like a prize. Kieran drew himself to his full height, and for a moment she was reminded of a wolf raising its hackles. Yet beneath that formidable exterior she sensed a flicker of understanding, almost gentleness. I know how it sounds, he said, softer this time. But in my world, in the tradition we've upheld, it's the alpha's privilege and burden to declare his mate. Normally, it aligns with the she-wolf who is strongest, who has proven her bond to the pack. But I won't dishonor you by disguising the truth. I am drawn to you, Mira. I need you to trust that I didn't come to this decision lightly. She let out a shaky laugh. You're telling me to trust you? You're some supernatural being I've never met, and you're telling me my entire future depends on your tradition. That's not exactly the best pitch for trust. He breathed out slowly, controlling the tension in his shoulders. I don't expect you to surrender to this easily. I only want you to listen to what I have to say, and then, perhaps, Spend some time among my pack. See our ways. We need to do this carefully if we want the pack to accept you. Let me give you a taste of this life. If you choose to fight me on it, then we'll sort that out. But if you are open, I swear by the moon I will protect you. I will see to it that you do not regret it." The magnitude of the moment pressed on her chest. She was human vulnerable in a world she only half believed in, until that very second. Could she simply tell him to leave and never come back? Possibly. But something in her gut told her that in the realm of werewolves, of primal traditions and unstoppable forces, that wasn't how things worked. If he was truly the Alpha, a refusal might set off consequences she couldn't imagine. She couldn't let herself be pushed around, but she also couldn't dismiss the reality of who he was. Then again, a spark of her innate defiance rose in her chest, daring her to stand her ground, no matter the cost. At length, she swallowed and stepped back, putting a hand on the door handle. "You need to leave. I can't deal with this right now." Kieran regarded her steadily, that mesmerizing gaze never wavering. "All right," he said, surprising her with his readiness to depart. "I'll give you a night to think this over, but I'll be back at dawn." He inclined his head gesture that felt both respectful and final. "Sleep well, Mira Carter." She said nothing, only stared as he disappeared into the night with fluid, silent steps that belied his size. Her heart thundered, her mind reeling. She managed to push open her door, stepping inside on shaky legs, not even remembering to turn on the lights until she realized she was standing in pitch black. Flicking on the overhead lamp, she locked every latch, checked her windows, and pressed her back to the wall, trying to collect her thoughts. She knew she wouldn't sleep. How could she, after having a conversation with a rumored werewolf alpha, who claimed he'd chosen here an ordinary humenta, be his mate? The entire situation was surreal, like a fever dream. But it was also undeniably real. All that night, she paced her living room, her mind a swirl of confusion and fear, but also a strange, undeniable pull. No matter how outraged or alone she felt, she couldn't ignore that a secret, deep part of her vibrated with curious anticipation. Something about his presence, the resonance of his voice, had awakened a restlessness she never knew she harbored. And that, she realized, was the most terrifying revelation of all, that maybe she wasn't wholly opposed to the notion of stepping across that boundary into his world. Even if she was furious at the lack of choice, some primal corner of her being wanted to know more. She wondered if she was losing her mind. By the time the first glimpse of early dawn light touched the sky, she had barely managed any real rest. Her thoughts circled in an endless loop. The name Kieran, the image of his intense eyes, the story about the blood moon tradition, and the possibility that her life was about to be shattered, remolded by ancient feral ways. She knew she had to do something, had to find a way to keep a grip on her autonomy, her life, but the best she could do was tell herself she wouldn't let him walk over her. No matter what, she wouldn't let that happen. When the clock read 6:30, there was a knock on the door, firm yet oddly polite. She froze, adrenaline spiking. This was it. A part of her wanted to stay silent and pretend she wasn't there, but she knew he would sense her presence regardless. Mustering her courage, she opened the door. Kieran stood there, expression composed, as though he were prepared to be stonewalled. He studied her weary face. "You didn't sleep?" "No," she said bluntly. "How was I supposed to sleep after that?" A faint nod. "I understand. May I come in?" Her immediate reaction was to refuse. She wanted to keep him on the doorstep, like a salesman she could send away. But then she wondered if that would accomplish anything. Gritting her teeth, she stepped aside. Fine, but keep your explanations short. He walked inside, taking in her modest living room with a quick sweep of his gaze. As he passed, she caught the faint scent of pine and the deep earthiness that clung to him like an aura. It brought to mind images of vast forests, nights under a full moon, shadows flitting between trees. It made her heart pound with unsteady excitement despite her resolve. "You said last night you'd give me a chance to decide," Mara said, crossing her arms and leaning against the wall to maintain distance. "I haven't decided anything. In fact, I'm leaning toward no. I'm human, Kieran. I have a life here. I manage the bookstore. My friends are here. My entire world is here. I'm not part of your pack. I don't know your pack ways, and I'm sure as hell not interested in letting someone else dictate my future." He nodded again, the faintest flicker of tension around his jaw. "I hear you, but I also know the clock is ticking. The blood moon is less than a month away, and to secure my leadership, my pack expects an official mate by then. I need you to at least give me a chance to show you what it means, what it could be like if you accept." She looked away, trying to ignore the frustration building inside. "And what if I don't accept by this blood moon? You'll do what, kidnap me?" His lips tightened. "No, that's not my way. But the pack is old-fashioned, steeped in tradition. If I fail to produce a mate, it may fracture their trust in me. And if I stand by my decision that you are my chosen, but you haven't accepted, it creates a vulnerability. Rival alphas will sense that weakness. There is one in particular, Alpha Rowan, who has bind circling our territory, seeking an opening. If he hears of this, he may attempt to claim you himself. In a twisted bid to undermine my leadership, I don't want that to be your fate." Mira's outrage flared. "Claim me himself? As if I'm an object? That's insane, Kieran. Do your kind really just treat mates like tokens of power?" His jaw flexed. "We are not all the same. But Rowan is brutal. He believes in taking what he wants, and if he thinks it will cripple another alpha's standing, he won't hesitate. The moment he learns you're a human someone the pack sees as unfit by tradition, he'll see it as a point of attack. I wish I could spare you these complications, but we don't live in an ideal world." She pressed a hand to her temple, feeling a headache forming. "And I suppose you want me to come with you now, so you can keep me under lock and key until I finally accept you?" He exhaled, controlling a flash of frustration. "No, I want you to willingly come into my territory, see the heart of our pack, understand who we are, and then decide. I understand it's a lot to ask, but I can protect you more effectively if you're with me." She glared at him. "And if I do come to see your pack and I hate it? If I say no in the end, then what?" A muscle worked in his cheek, but he managed to speak calmly. "Then you walk away, and I deal with the fallout. I won't force you to stay." She studied him for a long moment, trying to glean any hint of deception. Despite everything, she sensed he was being honest. Maybe that was foolish, given she barely knew him, but there was something in his Gazan intensity that brooked no lies. That realization unsettled her even more. If he had been obviously manipulative, it would have been easier to reject him outright. But his sincerity was disarming. "All right," she said at last, her voice terse. "I'll come see your pack, but I'm not promising anything more. You got that?" A flicker of relief crossed his face, though he quickly schooled his features. "Yes, thank you, truly." She held up a hand. "Don't thank me. I'm doing this for me. so I can see for myself if there's any sense in this madness. I'm not doing it for you." He dipped his head in acknowledgement. "Understood." She stepped away from the wall, exhaling slowly. "Just give me time to pack a bag. I need clothes, and I need to tell my coworker I'm taking a leave, even if it's just for a few days." "I'll wait here," he said quietly. Mira nodded stiffly and walked down the short hallway to her bedroom. As she threw essentials into a bag, she kept glancing at the door, half expecting Kieran to barge in. But he didn't, which strangely made her more uneasy. She wondered if she was making a mistake, if stepping willingly into the den of werewolves was an invitation for trouble. Then again, if she refused, she'd still be leaving herself exposed. The memory of his warning about the rival Alpha, Rowan, flickered in her thoughts. It chilled her blood to imagine what another pack might do. She might not fully trust Kieran, but if she had to take sides, a small voice told her that Kieran at least had enough conscience to try to do right by her. And the unsettling truth was that being near him had awakened some strange, inner pull that she couldn't deny. Zipping her bag, she lingered for a moment in her bedroom. Her gaze wandered to a photo on the dresser her parents, who had died in a car accident several years ago, leaving her with faint recollections and an ache that had dulled over time. Would they have believed a bizarre situation she was in? Her mother had always been the adventurous soul, the one who read tarot cards and claimed to sense spirits. Maybe she would have told Mira to trust her instincts, to follow the path that felt true rather than the path that felt safe. Her father, more grounded, would have probably tried to protect her from everything, telling her to keep as far away from wolves, mythical or otherwise, as she could. She didn't have them to guide her now, so she'd have to rely on her own judgment. "God," she whispered to the empty room. "I hope I'm not making the biggest mistake of my life." She forced herself to leave. When she returned to the living room, Kieran was looking at the spines of books on a shelf near her TV, one hand in the pocket of his jacket. He turned as she approached. "Ready?" "Yeah," she replied, gripping the strap of her bag. "Let's get this over with." He didn't comment on her brusque tone. They stepped outside, and she locked the door, feeling the finality of that small act. There was no going back now, at least not in the immediate sense. Kieran nodded in the direction of a sleek, dark SUV parked by the curb. She frowned. She'd half expected him to want them to run through the forest in wolf form, but apparently, Alphas could drive perfectly normal vehicles. The ride out of town was quiet, the tension big enough to cut. Mira stared out the window at the passing scenery, the once familiar roads stretching out beyond the outskirts. If she craned her neck, she could glimpse the distant silhouette of pine-drenched mountains. She used to love those mountains for their rugged beauty, the way the sunset lit them up in fiery reds and golds. Now they felt like an intimidating labyrinth waiting to swallow her whole. Next to her, Kieran drove with steady focus, exuding a calm that made her nerves hum. Despite the fact that he was an apex predator, there was a surprising gentleness in the way he handled the steering wheel, the measured breath he took when he glanced in her direction. She wasn't sure if it was real or just a calculated tactic to put her at ease. They finally turned onto a gravel road that led deeper into the forest. The SUV bumped along the rutted path, branches scraping the sides like skeletal fingers. It was a stark reminder that the territory she was entering was not frequently traveled by humans. After several winding turns, they arrived at a massive wooden gate adorned with intricate carvings of wolves and moons, battered by time and weather. Two imposing men stood guard on either side. Their postures were alert, and though they looked human enough, Mira noticed how their eyes seemed to glint oddly in the half-light. Kieran lowered his window and nodded at them. "She's with me," he said. The men exchanged a significant look, but stepped aside without question, putting the gates open. As they drove past, Mira felt a knot tighten in her stomach, a sense that she was crossing a threshold into a place where the old laws of nature and the supernatural still held sway. They continued along a winding trail until they reached a clearing, and that was when she saw the heart of the lunar eclipse pack's territory. Nestled among the soaring pines were several log-built structures, an arrangement that looked both rustic and solid. Smoke curled from chimneys, suggesting warmth within. There was a communal air about the place, more akin to a secluded village than a typical pack settlement. The presence of other werewolves was almost tangible, a low thrum of energy in the air. She saw groups of people, some men, some women walking between buildings, glancing curiously at the SUV as it arrived. Their posture was confident and live, reminiscent of predators at ease in their environment. For an instant, uncertainty and fear gnawed at Mira's resolve. This was a world that would see her as an outsider at best, an intruder at worst. Kieran parked near the largest structure, a sprawling lodge-like building with wide windows overlooking the forest. He turned off the engine and looked at her. "This is the main house. My living quarters are here, and many pack gatherings are held inside. I want you to see it. Meet a few key people if you're up for it." She swallowed the dryness in her throat. "I suppose I should. That's why I'm here, right?" He gave a small nod of encouragement. "Try not to feel overwhelmed. They'll be curious, but if anyone disrespects you, they'll answer to me." She cast him a wary glance. "That doesn't exactly reassure me," she muttered, but she opened the door anyway. Stepping out of the vehicle, she felt the raw energy of the territory envelop her. The air was crisper, more potent with the sense of pine, earth, and something primal. She heard the rustle of leaves, the distant flow of a creek. And beyond that, she sensed eyes watching her from the buildings and the edges of the clearing. Kieran came around to stand at her side, a silent pillar of presence that drew a few murmured greetings from the onlookers. A tall woman with auburn hair walked over, her steps purposeful. She wore a sleeveless tunic despite the chill, revealing toned arms and the hint of corded muscle. Her gaze flicked to Mira, then to Kieran. "Alpha," she said respectfully, inclining her head. "Welcome back." "Amara," Kieran acknowledged. "This is Mira Carter. She'll be staying here as my guest. Make sure she's treated with courtesy." Amara's eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second, clearly taking in the fact that Mira was human. Something akin to surprise, maybe even disapproval, flashed across her features, but she quickly masked it. "Of course," she said, looking at Mira more intently. "Welcome to our home. I'm sure you'll find it interesting." Mira forced a polite smile, her nerves on edge. "Thanks." They followed Kieran into the main house. Inside, the space was warm and inviting in an old-world way. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel carved with images of running wolves, phases of the moon. Plush chairs were arranged in a circle, and to one side a long wooden table bore the remnants of a recent meal, bowls of stew, baskets of bread. A few people were seated there, talking in low voices, their attention riveted on the new arrival. Mira could feel their scrutiny, their curiosity, some of it tinged with a wariness she couldn't miss. Kieran guided her down a hallway toward a room at the back. He pushed open a door, revealing a simple but cozy chamber with a bed, a small dresser, and a window overlooking the forest. "You can stay here," he told her. "It's close to my quarters, which are just down the hall. This way, if you need anything, I'll be nearby." She set her bag on the bed, looking around, taking in the rustic decor and the faint scent of pine and cedar that seemed to permeate the very walls. Suddenly, she felt exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. The strangeness of this entire environment pressed down on her, making her chest feel tight. Turning to Kieran, she found him watching her with a mixture of caution and something that might have been concern. "You all right?" he asked softly. She pressed her lips together. "As all right as I can be, given the circumstances." He nodded, as though accepting that answer without pushing. "I have a few responsibilities to attend to, meetings with my beta and the elders. Will you be okay on your own?" Mira almost laughed bitterly. Would she be okay on her own, surrounded by werewolves who might despise her? But she refused to appear weak. Lifting her chin, she said, "I'll manage." "Good." He hesitated. "Feel free to explore if you like. No one will harm you, and if anyone tries to intimidate you, let me know. This territory is my domain, and you are my chosen guest." His voice was quiet, but she could sense the power behind those words, the promise of protection. She nodded, unsure how to respond. Then he turned and left, closing the door gently behind him. Mira sank onto the bed, burying her face in her hands. She had held herself together thus far, but now, in the privacy of this room, a surge of pent-up emotion threatened to break free. Anger, confusion, a hint of fascination. She was a tangled mess of feelings. Logic told her to run, to find some way to slip out of the territory and make a break for her old life. But a deeper instinct told her that even if she fled, the supernatural entanglements had already begun. There was no going back to the quiet ignorance she once enjoyed. And then there was Kieran, dangerous, magnetic, determined. She wanted to hate him for upending her life, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the softness in his eyes when he spoke, the unyielding resolve that he would protect her, and the raw sense of power that both frightened and drew her. It infuriated her that some part of her was already curious about what it would mean to be bound to such a being, to have that primal connection coursing between them. Maybe it was madness, but a small voice in her soul whispered that it might also be fate. Exhaling shakily, she forced herself to stand and open the window. The forest stretched out beyond, a tapestry of towering pines and softly swaying foliage. She inhaled the cool, sharp air, letting it calm her racing heart. She had come here to see the truth of his world, to understand if there was anything worth staying for. She would take it one step at a time. In the days that followed, Mira found herself slipping ever deeper into the rhythms of pack life. At first, she wanted to hide in her room, only venturing out when absolutely necessary, but her pride refused to let her cower. She kept reminding herself that she was here of her own choice. Most lands she had every right to walk among them without shame. If Kieran believed she was meant to become the Luna of this pack, then by all means, she would at least prove that she wasn't easily frightened. Her first true test came one morning when she emerged from her room to find Amara waiting in the hallway. The tall she-wolf greeted her with a raised eyebrow and a slight tilt of her head. "Good morning," she said neutrally. Mira nodded. "Morning. Alpha Kieran asked me to show you around today," Amara continued. "He's in a meeting with the elders about your unique situation, but he wants you to see the territory. Are you up for it?" Mira squared her shoulders. "Sure. Lead the way." Amara took her through the main house, pointing out various common rooms and corridors, explaining which spaces were communal and which were private. They ended in the large kitchen area, where several pack members were cleaning up breakfast. Mira felt their gazes flick over her, some curious, others guarded. She tried to offer a polite smile, feeling painfully self-conscious. One older woman, with kind eyes and hair streaked with gray, gave her a small nod of greeting, which Mira returned gratefully. From there they ventured outside. The chilly air bit at Mira's cheeks, but she found it refreshing after the tension indoors. Amara led her around the cluster of log houses, introducing her in clipped tones to various pack members. Most responded politely to the Alpha's guest, though Mira detected the subtle wariness in their eyes. She noticed how they sized her up human, smaller than many of them, lacking the aura of raw power they all seemed to share. A few seemed intrigued, as if trying to figure out what their Alpha saw in her. Eventually, Amara guided her along a winding path deeper into the forest. The sun was just climbing above the tree line, illuminating patches of moss and ferns that blanketed the ground. Towering pines formed a dense canopy overhead, and the faint calls of birds broke the stillness. "This is a favorite hunting ground," Amara said, gesturing to the expanse of woodland. "We move in small groups, taking game as needed. We don't kill for sport, only for sustenance. The Alpha enforces that rule strictly." Mira nodded, taking in the mention of hunting. She felt a wave of discomfort, imagining them in wolf form chasing down prey. It wasn't something she wanted to dwell on. "So, how large is your territory?" "Quite large," Amara replied, a hint of pride creeping into her tone. "We don't often patrol the entire perimeter daily, but we maintain a presence. The pack is large enough to cover it, though Kieran has alliances with neighboring territories. We try to keep the peace." They walked in silence for a while, the forest enveloping them in its hushed majesty. Mira found some solace in the serenity of nature, though her mind kept drifting back to her precarious situation. Without preamble, she finally summoned the courage to ask a question that had been gnawing at her. "Do you disapprove of the Alpha's choice?" Amara slowed her pace, glancing over. "I think, She paused as if weighing her words. "I think it's unexpected. No one anticipated him choosing a human. The rite of the blood moon is a deeply ingrained tradition, not just for Kieran, but for the entire pack. We were prepared for him to select one of our own, someone with proven loyalty, with the strength to stand by him. It's part of how we reaffirm the Alpha's leadership. So, yes, this changes everything." Mira absorbed that, feeling a sting of defensiveness. "So you think I'm too weak to be his mate? Is that it?" Amara's lips twisted into a wry smile. "I don't know you well enough to judge your strength yet, but I do know our life isn't easy. We live by the old ways, and new ideas are slow to find acceptance. The pack might resist you, question your worth. Kieran is Caw, risking more than you realize." Mira's brow furrowed. "Then why did he choose me? He barely even knows me, only that I'm human." Amara gave her a calculating look. "I can't speak for him, but I suspect there's more to it than meets the eye. Our Alpha is not reckless. He may be guided by instincts that run deeper than mere logic. If he believes you're the one, it's because something in him and perhaps in you tells him so." Mira looked away, frustration welling up. Part of her was tired of all the mysticism and intuition talk. She wanted hard facts. But another part whispered that maybe these werewolves operated on a level that transcended what she considered normal reason. They continued on, the soft crunch of pine needles underfoot. After a time, they circled back toward the main settlement. More pack members were out and about now, chopping wood, tending to repairs on one of the cabins, or simply talking. Mira caught snippets of conversation, often noticing her name or the word human slip past. She did her best to keep her posture straight and ignore the sidelong glances. At the main lodge, they stopped at the threshold. "You're free to explore the common areas, or you can return to your room," Amara said. "I believe Kieran will want to speak with you once he's done with the elders. Until then, stay vigilant. Not everyone here will be thrilled about you." "Right," Mira murmured. She wanted to snap back with a sarcastic retort, but she held her tongue. Amara's bluntness might be off-putting, but at least it was honest. She stepped inside, the warmth of the lodge, a pleasant relief from the crisp air. Unsure of what to do, she wandered toward the lounge near the fireplace. A couple of young men sat there, deep in conversation. When they saw her approach, they fell silent, and one of them, a lanky fellow with blonde hair, offered a tentative smile. "Hello," she ventured, trying to keep her tone friendly. "Hey," the blonde one replied. "You're Mira, right? The Alpha's guest?" She nodded, aware of how her heart fluttered uncomfortably. "Yes, Mira Carter. I'm Nate," he said, inclining his head. He gestured to the other man with sandy brown hair. "This is Quinn. We were just talking about heading out on a patrol later. You know, scouting the perimeter." Mira mustered a smile, hoping she didn't look too awkward. "Nice to meet you both. I'm still trying to find my way around." Nate chuckled softly. "Yeah, I bet. Must be weird." His glance flicked to Quinn, who was regarding Mira with open curiosity but didn't speak. If you need anything, feel free to ask. Not everyone's got a problem with you." She was momentarily taken aback by his candidness. "Thank you," she managed. "I appreciate it." He gave a shrug. "Kieran's a good leader. He usually knows what he's doing." There was a note of respect in his voice, suggesting that while the situation might be odd to him, he trusted his Alpha's judgment. Quinn finally spoke. "You must have questions about us, or about the territory. Stuff you probably can't ask Kieran directly." Mira hesitated. "Actually, maybe just one for now." She let out a small breath. "Are you all expected to follow me if I become, your Luna? Like, do you have to obey me?" Nate rubbed the back of his neck, a half-smile on his face. "Well, the Luna is the Alpha's mate, but that doesn't automatically mean you can boss us around." He paused, noticing the way she bristled. "But you will have a certain standing. Your voice would carry weight, especially if you speak on behalf of the Alpha. The way I see it, though, that has to be earned. We're a pack, not mindless followers." "I see," she said. The idea of leadership roles among werewolves made her head spin, but at least they were being straightforward. "Thank you for explaining." She chatted a bit more with them, nothing too deep, mostly small talk about the territory, about the chores they had to do. She was relieved to find that some pack members were willing to meet her halfway. Maybe they were curious more than hostile, and she could handle curiosity. At some point, a large man with broad shoulders and a serious expression approached. Nate and Quinn immediately straightened, adopting more respectful postures. He had short dark hair and a trimmed beard, his eyes a sharp gray. Something about him radiated authority, not as commanding as Kieran's presence, but close. She guessed this might be the beta. "Alpha's finished with the elders," he said, addressing Mira directly. His tone was low, controlled, but not unkind. "He'd like to see you in his office." Mira rose, trying not to show her nervousness. "And you are?" "Bryce," he replied curtly. "The Alpha's second." She nodded, following him out of the lounge. He guided her down the hall to a closed door, then opened it without knocking. Inside was a modest office with a wooden desk, shelves filled with old ledgers, and a window that looked out onto the forest. Kieran stood behind the desk, brow furrowed as if in deep thought. But when his eyes lifted to Mira, the tension in his face eased. "Thank you, Bryce," Kieran said, a note of dismissal in his voice. The beta inclined his head and left, closing the door behind him. Mira glanced around, suddenly feeling trapped. She moved closer, stopping on the opposite side of the desk from Kieran. "So, how did it go with the elders?" His expression hardened slightly. "They're not pleased. They question the validity of choosing a human as my mate, but they're reserving final judgment until you've been here longer. They want to see if you can prove yourself worthy before the blood moon. Ceremony. Ah." She frowned. "Worthy how? I'm not going to wrestle a bear or something." A brief quirk of his lips showed a flicker of amusement. "No bear wrestling required, at least not yet. The elders want to test your resolve, your commitment to the pack. They'll be observing you, looking for any signs of weakness or duplicity." Her frustration rose. "But I never asked to be part of this in the first place." He exhaled slowly, coming around the desk to stand nearer. She fought the urge to step back, refusing to be intimidated, even though he towered over her. "I know," he said quietly, his voice tinged with empathy. "But we're here now, and the pack's traditions won't bend without reason. If we're to convince them, we must show unity, or at least understanding. Don't you see how unfair this is?" she demanded, her voice trembling with the force of her emotions. "I never chose this path. I never asked to be your mate, or to deal with centuries of werewolf customs. Yet here I am, forced to prove something to your people." He stepped closer still, and the heat of his presence was almost overwhelming. "I won't pretend it's fair," he admitted. "But neither is it fair to my pack if the Alpha discards tradition without explanation. I stand between two worlds right now, my duty to them and this bond I sense with you. If I fail to bridge that gap, everything could fall apart." Mira's heart thudded. She hated how compelling he could be when he spoke of his responsibilities. She hated how a part of her understood the weight he bore. "I wish you had given me a choice," she said softly. He regarded her, eyes glowing with that unearthly color. "I'm sorry," he said, surprising her with the quiet sincerity of his tone. "Maybe I should have approached you differently, but I couldn't risk losing the only chance I believe I have. Something in me, something deeper than logic, tells me you are meant to stand by my side. I had to act." She shook her head, swallowing hard. "Well, it's too late to change the way you did it now." He paused, then gently touched her arm, just enough to let her feel the warmth of his hand. The contact sent a jolt through her system, a strange mixture of alarm and undeniable awareness. She should have pulled away, but somehow she couldn't. "I promise," he said in a low voice, "that if you stay, if you give this a chance, I will do everything in my power to ensure you're treated with respect. You won't be alone in this." Mira raised her gaze to meet his. For a moment, the tension between them was almost palpable. She might have despised him for thrusting her into this situation, but she couldn't deny that there was something fierce, something magnetic, that drew her. It was the same feeling that had kept her awake at night, the sense that this was bigger than both of them, fueled by instincts and forces she only half understood. "I want to keep my autonomy," she said, her voice shaky. "I'm not just going to become some figurehead for your pack." A faint nod. "I understand, and I wouldn't expect you to. But you must realize, being an alpha's mate is no simple role. If the bond is completed, it will heighten your senses, link you more deeply with me and the pack. It's as intense, even by werewolf standards. Her chest tightened. That's exactly what scares me. He lifted his hand, hesitated as though he wanted to brush his fingers across her cheek, but then drew back. If it helps, the bond can only be completed with your consent. Even in the old ways, forced mating is considered an abomination. So, if your fear is that I'll coerce you, that won't happen. His words were firm, but they did little to ease the confusion swirling in her mind. She managed a faint nod, stepping back to break the tension. "Oh, right. Thank you." The moment hung heavy, and she realized how tired she still felt from the emotional turmoil. He seemed to sense it, for he gestured to the door. "You should rest or at least get some air. Explore on your own if you'd like. Amara can go with you if you want a guide, or you can have your privacy." "Okay," she whispered, turning to leave. Just before she stepped into the hall, she paused. "Kieran," she said, not meeting his eyes. "I'm giving this a chance, but if it comes down to it and I decide it's not for me, you won't stop me from going home, right?" A shadow crossed his features. "I won't force you," he repeated, though his voice was tight. "But by then, there might be complications, especially with Rowan sniffing around. If you leave without the bond, he may see you as fair game. I can't guarantee your safety outside these walls if you're not officially part of my pack." She wanted to protest that this was just another form of coercion, but the look in his eyes told her it was the truth. The world beyond might not be safe for her anymore, not after she'd become a pawn in a supernatural power game. Her stomach clenched with anxiety, but she couldn't let it paralyze her. She had to walk forward, one step at a time. She nodded once and slipped out, walking back down the hall. Her thoughts churned with every step. A part of her wanted to rage at the unfairness, to scream that she never asked for any of this. Another part whispered that she had felt all her life that something lurked just beyond her understanding, and now it had come to her doorstep in the form of a powerful, compelling alpha who claimed to sense a bond with her. Maybe it was destiny. Maybe it was Magnus. Or maybe, somewhere in the tangled mess, it was both. She reached her room, intending to hide for a bit, when she heard raised voices from somewhere outside. Frowning, she placed her bag on the bed and hurried to the window. At the far edge of the clearing, she saw a small gathering of pack members, their posture tense. Unsure what was happening but propelled by concern, she left her room and walked outside, the cold air instantly chilling her cheeks. As she neared the gathering, she heard snippets of conversation, something about an intruder, tension, and how the border patrol had found someone wandering the edge of their territory. Amara, Bryce, and several others stood in a semicircle. In the middle, 2 sentries had a disheveled man pinned by the arms. He wore a ragged jacket, his face pale with fatigue. Mira stopped at the edge of the group, trying to see what was going on. As soon as she did, the man's wild-eyed gaze locked on her. "You," he croaked, clearly disoriented. "You're a human too. Please help me." A murmur rippled through the assembled werewolves. Amara stepped forward, demanding answers, while Bryce hovered protectively, scanning the man for hidden weapons or signs of threat. Mira's heart pounded. A human trespassing in the werewolf territory was bound to cause panic. She inched closer, ignoring the wary looks thrown her way. "Let me through," she said quietly, her voice shaking a bit. The pack members parted slightly, though they watched her carefully. She approached the man, who looked terrified. "What's your name?" The man winced, swallowing hard. "Samuel, please. I didn't know where I was. My car broke down on the highway, and I got lost trying to find help. Then I saw these wolves, massive wolves, and I panicked." He trailed off, trembling under the grip of the two werewolves. "I just want to go home." Mira could see the raw fear in his eyes. He probably stumbled into something he couldn't comprehend. The memory of her own arrival flashed in her mind. She glanced at Amara. "He seems to be telling the truth. You're not going to hurt him, are you?" Amara's gaze was steely. "We have to make sure he isn't a spy from a rival pack or a threat. Humans don't typically stray this far." Mira bristled. "He looks harmless, clearly terrified. If you want to question him, can you do it without scaring him half to death?" She was aware of how precarious her own position was, a human lecturing werewolves in their own territory, but she couldn't help it. Bryce tilted his head, regarding her calmly. "We won't harm him if he's truly innocent, but we can't let him leave without ensuring he won't expose our location." Mira's stomach churned. This was the reality of the pack's secrecy. They didn't allow strangers to wander off with knowledge of their settlement. "So, what happens to him?" she asked softly. Kieran's voice cut through the tension. "That's what we'll decide." He stepped into the clearing, flanked by a few elders, his mere presence commanding immediate silence. The pack members parted for him like water around a rock. He assessed Samuel with a cool, measured stare. The man stared back, fear plain on his face. "Alpha," Amara greeted, bowing her head briefly. "We found him on the northern perimeter." Kieran nodded. "Take him inside. Give him water, something to eat. He'll remain under guard until we're satisfied he poses no threat and won't reveal our existence." Relief flickered across Samuel's features, likely realizing he wasn't going to be executed on the spot. Mira felt a rush of gratitude toward Kieran for not being ruthless. The man might have stumbled into the territory out of pure misfortune, but that didn't mean the pack would simply let him lock. She approached Kieran, lowering her voice. "Thank you. He doesn't deserve to be punished for being lost." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "We don't kill innocent humans," he said simply, "but we can't let him leave without certain precautions." She opened her mouth to argue surely they weren't going to keep this man prisoner indefinitely, but she caught the elder's sharp gaze flicking between her and Kieran. She realized how precarious her own standing was. She'd only just begun to earn a tentative acceptance. Perhaps she needed to tread carefully. The next hour passed in a blur. Samuel was brought inside, seated at a table, and offered food and drink. Bryce and Amara questioned him gently while Kieran looked on. Mira lingered at the edge, watching the interrogation. She felt a pang of sympathy for Samuel. He was clearly frightened and confused, answering with halting honesty about how his car had blown a tire, how he'd wandered off the main road, how he'd panicked upon seeing giant coal. Wolves in the distance. At one point, his gaze locked on Mira as though seeking reassurance. She offered a small, shaky smile, hoping to quell his terror. After a time, Bryce and Amara exchanged a glance and turned to Kieran. "He's telling the truth," Bryce said quietly. "He has no clue where he is or who we are. There's no sign he's a spy." Kieran considered, arms folded over his chest. "Then we'll keep him for a short while. Once we're certain he won't bring trouble to our doorstep, we'll arrange for him to leave safely. We can't have random humans wandering in again." A low rumble of agreement came from the pack members. Samuel gulped, nodding vigorously. I swear I won't tell a soul. Just, please, let me go soon. My family must be worried. Kieran's expression softened slightly. We'll do what we can. As the tension settled, the pack members began dispersing. Mira found herself alone with Kieran, Samuel, and a couple of guards who hovered by the doorway. The man seemed calmer now that no one was actively threatening him. Mira stepped closer, lowering her voice. You'll be all right, Samuel. Just do as they say, and you'll get out of here. He nodded shakily. Why, yeah. Thanks. You're human, right? She glanced at Kieran, who wore a guarded look. Yes, she admitted, then added, but that's a long story. Samuel let out a humorless laugh. I bet. Kieran placed a hand on Mira's shoulder, a gentle pressure guiding her away. Come, he said quietly. Let's give him some space. She relented, letting Kieran lead her out of the room. Once in the hallway, she turned to him. You're handling this better than I expected. I figured your pack might do something harsh. He inclined his head. In the old days, the outcome might have been grim, but I'm Alpha now, and I do not condone unnecessary bloodshed. His voice was cool, but his eyes glimmered with a subdued warmth. We must change with the times, and that means not harming those who pose no true threat. Mira absorbed that, a small kernel of admiration blossoming despite her misgivings. It seemed Kieran wanted to push his pack in a direction that was less brutal, more balanced. Even if their entire dynamic still unsettled her, she couldn't deny that was a step toward reason. She sighed. At least something good came out of this, though I worry about what that means for me. If I ever leave, will I also be forced to keep my mouth shut about all of this? His gaze sharpened. Yes, for your own safety as well as ours. Spreading news of our existence only invites hunters, fanatic groups, or rival packs with designs on expansion. There are reasons we keep to ourselves. She nodded slowly, her throat tight. Another reminder that her life would never be the same. Still, she tried to brush off the lingering heaviness. All right, she said. Let's not dwell on that now. He extended a hand, palm up, as though inviting her to take it. She hesitated, staring at it. Part of her wanted to refuse, to maintain her distance, but something inside her relented. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. The warmth of his skin wrapped around her, a comforting steadiness in a world spinning off its axis. Come, he said softly, leading her through the corridor to a door at the far end. Beyond it lay a small courtyard sheltered by tall pines. A stone bench rested beneath a large cedar, its branches whispering in the breeze. He guided her to sit, settling next to her, releasing her hand but maintaining a closeness that made her pulse jump. They sat in silence for a long moment. The gentle rustle of branches and the faint call of a distant bird provided a soothing backdrop. She found herself oddly thankful for the reprieve from the pack's scrutiny. Tell me something about you, Kieran said quietly, breaking the silence. Something that has nothing to do with wolves or packs. Mira blinked at him. The question was so unexpected that she laughed, a short, breathy sound. Like what? He shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. Anything. A childhood memory, a hobby, a dream for the future. She fiddled with the hem of her shirt, gathering her thoughts. Well, I grew up here, but my parents died in a car accident when I was 19. After that, I threw myself into working at the bookstore. I'm not sure if it was because I was passionate about books or because I needed to lose myself in something. But now, I can't imagine doing anything else. I love stories, the way they transport you somewhere else. Sometimes I think the real world can be too harsh, and stories help you cope." He listened intently, his gaze unwavering. "I understand. For us, stories are passed down orally most times, but they serve the same purpose to connect us, to make sense of our reality. I respect your passion." Her heart did a weird little flip at his sincerity. She brushed it aside. "What about you? Don't tell me about the pack. Tell me something personal." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the towering trees. "My father died when I was young, 2 killed by a rogue. My mother tried to hold the pack together until I was old enough to assume leadership. The day I officially became Alpha was both the proudest and the saddest day of my life. I realized then that everything rested on my shoulders, the entire pack, our traditions, their safety. Ever since, I've never known a day without responsibility." Mira felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. She placed a tentative hand on his arm. "I'm sorry. I know how it feels to lose family." He met her gaze, appreciation shining in his eyes. They sat there, quietly acknowledging each other's losses, letting the hush of the courtyard cloak them in a moment of fragile peace. She tried to ignore the steady thrum of her pulse, the awareness that they were leaning into each other. Eventually, he shifted. "You should rest. Today's been eventful, and tomorrow we'll begin preparing you for what it means to stand before the pack, to show them you are not our enemy." Her stomach clenched. "Stand before them? As in some sort of formal introduction?" He gave a short nod. "We'll have a gathering tomorrow night. It's the first step in your acceptance. The elders want to see how you handle yourself." Fear skittered through her gut, but she forced a nod. "Fine," she whispered. "I'll do it." He rose, and she followed. Without thinking, she found herself leaning slightly into his side, as though his presence brought some measure of security. It was a realization that sent her thoughts reeling. She was supposed to be resisting this bond, but already, in the quiet quarters of her mind, she recognized how easy it would be to fall under Kieran's spell. She had to stay on guard. They parted ways at the door, he returning to his duties, she retreating to her room. That night, she tossed and turned, haunted by dreams of wolves and blood moons, of being caught between yearning and fear. And in every dream, Kieran's eyes glowed through the darkness, tethering her to a fate she had never asked for but one she could no longer deny. Mira woke to the faint gleam of pre-dawn light filtering through her window. She lay still, her heart racing from a half-remembered dream in which she'd been running under a blood-red moon, its scarlet light twisting everything into strange silhouettes. Her lungs felt tight, as though she really had been sprinting through the forest, pursued by something far larger than herself. Biting her lip, she forced herself to sit up, brushing tangled hair away from her face. She listened to the silence of the pack's settlement. Usually, she could hear the low hum of conversation in the halls, the early risers prepping breakfast or heading out for an early patrol. Today, the hush weighed even heavier than usual. She recalled Kieran's announcement the previous afternoon. There would be a gathering that very evening, a formal assembly where she would be expected to present herself to the entire pack. The elders wanted to observe her character, her demeanor, and judge whether she was worthy of standing beside the Alpha. The mere idea made her shudder, conjuring images of standing center stage, surrounded by dozens of curious, skeptical, or outright hostile pairs of eyes. She had no illusions about the pack's response. Many were still uneasy. Some outright opposed to the idea that their alpha would choose a human, ignoring every tradition that stated he should select a strong, proven she-wolf as his mate. As she dressed, pulling on thick jeans and a soft sweater that offered warmth against the mountain chill, she tried to steel her nerves. She reminded herself that she had chosen to come here. She had agreed to see this world firsthand, to understand if she could live in it. But at times, she felt as though the decision was slipping through her fingers, shaped more by inevitability than by her own free will. Yes, Kieran had said he wouldn't force the bond, but how free was she really? If leaving meant being tracked by rival wolves who saw her as an easy tool to undermine Kieran's rule. She was caught between fear and fascination. It was a precarious emotional balancing act that wore down her defenses day by day. She stepped into the hallway, her senses sharpened by nerves. The wooden floorboards creaked under her boots. The faint smell of breakfast bacon, eggs, maybe coffee drifted from the communal dining area. She paused, debating whether to slip out for a walk to clear her head, but her stomach growled, reminding her she hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon. Holding her chin high, she headed toward the source of that savory aroma, silently preparing herself for the stares and whispers. A handful of pack members were already seated at the massive wooden table that served as the lodge's heart, a place for meals, announcements, gatherings. She recognized a few faces, Nate and Quinn from the other day, the older woman with kind eyes who'd nodded at her in passing, and a couple more who had only given her polite, distant greetings. Amara and Bryce were absent, likely busy with their morning duties. Kieran was nowhere to be seen either, which left Mira feeling oddly vulnerable. She caught Nate's eye. He waved her over, shifting to make space on the bench next to him. Mira hesitated, then decided to accept the invitation. Right away, she could feel how the others stilled in their conversation, half listening, half trying not to be rude. She forced a small smile, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "Morning," she murmured, sitting down. "Smells good." Nate grinned, handing her a plate. "One of our folks here is a wizard in the kitchen," he said, nodding toward the older woman, who flushed with pride at the compliment. "She's practically the pack's official cook, though we all pitch in when needed." Mira dipped her head in thanks, then scooped some eggs and bacon onto her plate. Her stomach clenched with a mix of hunger and tension, but she forced herself to eat slowly. She was aware of the hush from the others, the subtle glances. Finally, after a minute, the chatter resumed in quiet tones, as though her presence wasn't as shocking as it had been on day one. Maybe that was progress, or maybe they'd simply run out of new ways to stare at her. Still, she caught fragments of conversation about the gathering tonight. Apparently, it was an old custom for the entire pack to assemble under the rising moon, sharing news, stories, and reaffirming bonds. This time, the highlight would undoubtedly be the Alpha's unveiling of his chosen mate. She kept her head down, willing the bacon not to turn to ash in her mouth from nervousness. She had no script for how to behave. The most she could do was stand tall, speak honestly if asked questions, and hope she didn't accidentally insult anyone. She also worried about Rowan, the rival Alpha Kieran had mentioned. What if he got wind of tonight's gathering? Would he try something brazen, sneaking into the territory to sow dissent or cause trouble? The possibility made her skin crawl. When she finished her breakfast, she gave Nate a quick thanks and slipped outside. The crisp air felt bracing, and she took a moment to watch the early sunlight dapple the clearing. A handful of younger wolves, barely in their late teens or early 20s, were stacking firewood. A small group of older pack members murmured near the edge of the forest, possibly discussing patrol routes. Mira remembered seeing patrols vanish into the trees each morning and afternoon, ensuring no threat human or supernatural breached their borders undetected. For the first time, she truly began to grasp the scale of running a pack. It was not just about being the biggest wolf or the strongest fighter. It was about leadership, protection, and unity. She wondered if Kieran felt that weight every hour of every day. She walked aimlessly, letting her feet carry her toward a path that led away from the main buildings. The trees thickened as she moved farther, the shadowed undergrowth blanketed in soft moss. Golden sunbeams reached through the branches, illuminating specks of dust dancing in the air. She inhaled deeply, savoring the scent of pine, damp earth, and faint wildflowers. As tense as this entire situation was, she couldn't deny the beauty of this place. There was a kind of serenity in nature's raw vastness. She heard soft footsteps behind her. Whirling, she found Amara approaching. The tall woman inclined her head. Her expression darted. "You walk quietly for a human," she remarked, though Mira couldn't tell if it was a criticism or a backhanded compliment. "I was just clearing my head," Mira replied, forcing her voice to remain calm. "It's a bit much, getting ready for tonight." Amara crossed her arms. "Yes, I figured you might be on edge. The elders have been talking non-stop about how this gathering will set the tone for your acceptance, or rejection." Mira swallowed. "They could still reject me outright." Amara shrugged. "If they decide you're an unfit mate for the Alpha, they'll voice their disapproval and pressure Kieran to choose someone else. The official rite of the blood moon is a separate thing, that's the actual ceremony that cements the mate bond if you both consent, but this gathering is like a test run. The elders want to gauge the pack's sentiment." She paused, eyeing Mira. "And you." Mira's heart gave an anxious flutter. "Lovely." For a moment, Amara just watched her with that unreadable gaze. Then, surprising Mira, she softened her stance. "It's not impossible for you to earn their approval, Mira. Despite what you may think, the pack members follow tradition. But they're not heartless. If they see genuine strength, empathy, and loyalty in you particularly, if you show that you care for the well-being of this pack, they can come around." Mira twisted her fingers together, a habit she'd never outgrown. "I do care," she said quietly. "I mean, I'm not here just to sabotage them. I don't want them to suffer. I'm just not sure if I'm ready to become one of them." Amara nodded, a faint flicker of understanding in her eyes. "That's what they need to see, that you're at least open to giving this a real try, that you won't bolt at the first sign of trouble or use our secrets against us." She hesitated. "Anyway, Kieran asked me to help you prepare. It was my intention to do so whether I liked it or not, but..." She exhaled. "I think it's only fair if I offer you real assistance instead of forcing you to stumble blind. The elders will ask questions during the gathering. They're blunt people. If you want to leave a decent impression, you need to answer carefully without seeming dishonest." Mira's shoulders tensed. She had never been good at performing in front of an audience, let alone an audience that could shift into wolves and potentially despised her. "All right," she said, voice quiet. "I'd appreciate your help." Amara walked over to a fallen log and sat down, motioning for Mira to join her. The forest felt alive around them, birds calling in the canopy, a squirrel darting across a branch. The elders might ask about your background, your family, your ties to the human world. They'll want to know if you could ever betray us, intentionally or accidentally. Many werewolves have faced persecution in the past, so..." Secrecy is paramount. Mira nodded. I'll just be honest. I didn't even know werewolves truly existed until Kieran appeared at my doorstep, and I have no intention of blabbing about it to the entire world. I'm well aware that people can be cruel to what they don't understand. Amara gave a small nod. Good. They might also question your feelings regarding the mating bond, whether you truly respect Kieran, whether you can see yourself building a life here. Obviously, you can't promise your whole future after just a few days, but you need to express that you aren't dismissing the possibility. Righty, Mira murmured, trying not to picture the tense circle of watchers she'd face. What if someone demands that I prove I can fight, or shift, or something impossible like that? I'm human. I don't have your strength or senses. You're not expected to demonstrate wolf abilities, Amara replied, and Mara replied, edge of impatience in her tone. They might test your courage in other ways, verbal sparring, for instance. Some she-wolves might challenge you openly, especially those who resent that Kieran didn't pick them. Stand your ground, but don't get baited into losing your temper. Show self-control. Mira let out a shaky breath. I'll try. They spend the next hour running through hypothetical questions, statements, or challenges the elders, or certain pack members, might hurl at her. Amara didn't coddle her. She snapped out harsh rapid-fire barbs, testing how Mira would respond under pressure. Though it felt overwhelming, Mira found herself strangely grateful for the chance to practice, to refine how she might speak or handle confrontation. Over time, she felt her confidence solidify, fragile, but present. Eventually, they returned to the main area. The sun was high overhead, crisp autumn air making the leaves glitter gold and red. There was a purposeful energy among the pack as they set about tasks, preparing for the evening's gathering. Logs were arranged in a wide circle, a central fire pit was cleared of old ash, and torches were placed around the clearing to illuminate the area once night fell. Some werewolves hefted large tables for food, others tested drums and instruments that Mira guessed might be used in some sort of ritual ceremony. The entire place buzzed with anticipation. Kieran emerged from the lodge, flanked by Bryce and two older men with serious expressions. When he spotted Mira and Amara, he excused himself from the conversation and made his way over. She could practically feel the tension radiating off him. Yet when he reached her, he gave a small smile, as though relieved to see her. "How are you?" he asked, voice low enough that only she and Amara would hear. He brushed his gaze across her face, searching for signs of distress. "I'm as ready as I can be," she answered. She glanced toward the preparations. "It's a lie." He followed her gaze, nodding. "It is. We hold gatherings often, but tonight is special, given the circumstances. The elders see it as a public forum to assess you. I'm sorry to put you through that." She swallowed. "I knew when I was agreeing to. Doesn't mean I'm not terrified." His eyes softened. "You don't have to face it alone, you know." He hesitated. Then, with a brief look of polite dismissal toward Amara, he placed a hand on Mira's arm. "Come with me." Amara gave them a curt nod and strode off, likely to confer with Bryce or assist with another matter. Meanwhile, Kieran guided Mira toward a more secluded spot near the edge of the clearing, away from prying ears. Once they reached the tree line, he turned to face her, his posture subdued. "I want you to understand something about tonight," he began, pausing as though to organize his thoughts. "The pack's acceptance is important, vital. If they reject you, we'll face massive internal discord, and Rowan will see his chance to strike. But I also need you to know that you should never force yourself into something you truly cannot handle. If at any point you feel it's too much, If you must walk away, I won't stop you. Why? He grimaced as though even voicing that possibility pained him. I just pray it doesn't come to that. The sincerity in his tone caused a lump to form in her throat. I don't want to walk away. I'm just not sure if I can measure up. I'm human, Kieran. What if I'm not enough? He gently took her hand, his thumb grazing the back of it, a calming gesture that sent heat through her veins. You're more than you realize, he said softly. I've seen your courage, your empathy for Samuel, your willingness to speak up even among strangers. These are qualities my pack respects, whether they admit it or not. Show that side of yourself tonight, and let them judge fairly. She shivered, more from the intensity of his gaze than the chill in the air. What about Rowland? She asked, lowering her voice. Has there been any sign of him? Kieran's jaw tightened. Our scouts have not reported any direct incursions, but they've seen glimpses of strange wolves near the border's likely spies. I suspect Rowan is biding his time, waiting to see if we weaken internally. If the pack rejects you, we might just give him the opening he needs. But if we stand together, he'll have to retreat, for now. Mira nodded, silently resolving to do her part. The idea of a rival alpha, violent and cunning, made her stomach twist. If there was anything she could do to prevent Rowan's meddling, she would at least try. One thing was certain, she didn't want to be dragged off by a power-hungry werewolf, used as leverage or something worse. As dusk approached, the pack's clearing transformed. Torches flickered, encircling the open space with dancing light, while the great bonfire in the center crackled and popped, sending sparks swirling into the sky. People gathered in clusters, speaking in hushed tones. The entire atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Mira stood near the edge, her nerves taut. She had changed into a simple, dark, outfitter, comfortable pair of boots and a long-sleeved shirt that offered warmth while still allowing her ease of movement. She didn't have fancy dresses or ceremonial garments, and she suspected that wasn't what anyone wanted to see anyway. Better to appear as her normal self. Amara had told her that Kieran would call her into the circle once the elders were prepared. Until then, she had little to do but wait, watch, and try to quell the butterflies in her stomach. Her gaze drifted over the crowd, noticing how many of the pack members looked so at home here, leaning on one another's shoulders, laughing, or baring their teeth in playful banter. She realized with an odd pang that, for them, this was family, a massive, sometimes fractious, but undeniably loyal family. Was there a place for her in such a group? She felt a presence approach before she saw it. Turning, she found Bryce at her elbow, his expression neutral. "It's time," he said in a low, unhurried tone. Her heart skipped. She exhaled shakily. "All right, let's go." He led her toward the circle of torches, where Kieran stood at the center by the roaring bonfire. The elders formed a loose semicircle behind him, figures of authority in various stages of age and experience. Amara stood off to one side, her posture straight, her face unreadable. Silence began to ripple outward as more and more pack members realized the gathering was about to begin. Gradually, the entire clearing fell quiet. Kieran met Mira's gaze across the flames, a subtle reassurance in his eyes. Lifting his hands, he addressed his people. "We gather tonight under the watching moon, to unite as a pack and to look forward to the future. As you all know, the rite of the blood moon is upon us. Our traditions dictate that the alpha must select a mate to strengthen the bond of leadership. However," he paused, as though acknowledging the tension, "I have chosen someone unexpected. Mira Carter." Murmurs spread through the crowd, some cautious, others critical. Mira felt every eye slide toward her, felt the weight of countless judgments and questions in that collective stare. Her throat threatened to close, but she forced her feet to move, stepping forward so that she stood beside Kieran at the edge of the bonfire's light. "She's human," Kieran continued, tone calm and resolute, "but she has shown a courage and spirit that resonates beyond her mortal limits. I ask you now, my pack, to see her as I do, a potential ally, a potential partner in the trials that lie ahead." One of the elders stepped forward. Mira recognized her as a stern woman named Kaliana, her hair streaked with silver, her eyes sharp as a hawk's. She wore a cloak that draped heavily over her shoulders, and around her neck hung a carved wolf pendant. "Speak, Mira Carter," Kaliana said. "We have heard from our Alpha, but we wish to hear from you. Tell us why you think you can stand with us. Why should the Lunar Eclipse Pack accept you as our future Luna?" The question was direct, possibly even combative. Mira swallowed, shooting a quick glance at Kieran, who gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. Gathering her courage, she faced Kaliana and raised her voice so all could hear. "I won't pretend I know all the ways of your pack," she began, her tone trembling slightly before she steadied it. "I'm new to this world, and I never expected to be part of it. When Alpha Kieran told me he had chosen me, I was angry, confused, and honestly frightened. But I came here because I wanted to see if there was something real, something worth fighting for. What I found is a family one that looks out for each other, that stands strong against threats. I don't have fangs or claws, but I do have a heart that refuses to see harm done to innocent people. I've shown that in small ways already, by standing up for a lost human you found in your territory. And I can promise that if I stay, I will do my best to protect and uphold the well-being of this pack. I know it's not conventional, but that's all I can offer. My honesty, my willingness, and the determination to learn." A hush fell, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Kaliana's stare remained piercing, evaluating every syllable. Another elder, a stoop-shouldered man with a gray beard, stepped forward next. "Our traditions are old," he said, voice raspy with age. "They serve to protect us from the cruelty of the outside world. How can we trust that you won't, one day, decide to reveal our secrets to outsiders, to the humans you come from? Even if we accept you, the future could bring conflict. Our ways might clash with your old life." Mira drew a breath. "I understand your wariness, but I have no desire to expose you. In fact, everything I've seen here has taught me how necessary your secrecy is. I wouldn't want to endanger you or place myself in danger either. As for conflicts, sure there will be many, but conflicts can be resolved with respect and compromise, whether you're human or werewolf." A low rumble of conversation spread through the pack. Some heads nodded, others shook. She could practically feel the skeptical glances of those who believed the risk was too great, that a human was too fragile a link to anchor their proud alpha. Kieran watched in silence, letting the elders take the lead in questioning her, possibly because that was how tradition demanded it. Mira's palms felt clammy, but she held her ground. After several more questions about her intentions, her background, and her will to adapt, an unexpected voice rang out from the opposite side of the crowd. "What if your presence makes us weaker?" A she-wolf with braided black hair stepped forward, glaring. Mira recognized her from the training grounds earlier that week, a formidable woman named Sienna, rumored to be one of the strongest fighters in the pack. "By choosing you, the Alpha might be ignoring one of our own, someone born to fight by his side. That's how it's always been done. If a rival pack attacks, How exactly are you going to defend us? With kind words? A few scattered chuckles erupted from pack members who clearly shared Sienna's doubts. Mira felt a flush creep up her neck. This was the public challenge that Amara had warned her might come. She squared her shoulders. "I might not be a skilled fighter," she said, her voice carrying a steel edge, "but I'm not helpless. And there's more to a pack than physical might. There's strategy, diplomacy, and empathy. If a rival alpha tries to attack, I'll do whatever is necessary to protect the people I care about, learn to fight, if I must. But I believe that one's strength isn't just measured in how hard you can hit." Sienna snorted, about to retort, but Kaliana held up a hand for silence. The elder turned to Kieran. "She speaks well, but words can only go so far. Leadership is proven through actions." "You vouch for her, Alpha Kieran?" "I do," he replied, voice resonant. "Mira has already shown both courage and compassion. She's resourceful, intelligent. She may not have a wolf's strength, but she has something else, an unwavering spirit." Kaliana studied him, then gave a slow nod. She peered out at the pack, her eyes glinting in the firelight. "Very well. This is not the official rite of the blood moon, but it is a test of unity. We, the elders, will observe how Mira interacts with us in the coming days. We will keep watch for further signs of her sincerity or deception. When the blood moon arrives, we will either stand by the Alpha's choice or denounce it. Let this be known. If we find her lacking, we will make our judgment clear." A ripple of energy coursed through the gathered wolves, some displeasure, some acceptance, many uncertain. But at least no one had openly denounced her. Mira exhaled, her tense posture relaxing a fraction. It wasn't an enthusiastic welcome, but it was also not a rejection. A middle ground, precarious, but better than immediate condemnation. As though sensing the crowd's shift in mood, Kieran inclined his head to Kaliana. "Thank you, Elder." Then he raised his voice, addressing the pack. "We have a month until the blood moon. Let us use this time to prepare ourselves, not just for the rite, but for any threat beyond our borders. Stay vigilant." Slowly, conversations resumed. Some pack members drifted forward to greet Kieran, while others shot Mira curious glances. She saw Sienna scowl and walk away, but a few individuals like Nate and Quinn offered her faint smiles of encouragement. As the tension diluted, a few of the younger werewolves began drumming on hollowed logs, a slow, rhythmic beat that gave a ceremonial aura to the night. Some began dancing around the fire, their movements fluid and feral, reminiscent of wolves at play. Mira stepped away from the bonfire, feeling the heat on her back, trying to calm her racing heart. She was startled when Kieran appeared at her side, his presence quiet yet magnetic. Without a word, he placed a hand lightly at her waist, guiding her toward the perimeter of the clearing. She felt self-conscious at the public display of closeness, but no one seemed to find it odd. This was their alpha after all, and in werewolf society, physical connection, particularly for mates, was not taboo. "You did well," he murmured, leaning in so she could hear him over the drum beats. "You spoke with conviction." She nodded, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "I was so nervous, my heart still pounding, but at least they didn't tear me to pieces figuratively or literally." A corner of his mouth quirked in a faint smile. "They may still test you, but yes, this is better than outright rejection." His expression sobered. "Be cautious in the coming weeks. If Rowan's spies are watching, they may attempt to stir trouble, or spread rumors that you're unfit. We must show a united front." Mira wrapped her arms around herself, partly for warmth, partly for comfort. I'll try. I just hope I don't disappoint." "You won't," he said with quiet confidence. "I have faith in you." The words caused a bloom of warmth in her chest, a sense of validation she hadn't expected. She'd been battling so hard to find her place here, uncertain of whether she even wanted it. But hearing his belief in her fanned a tiny spark of determination. Maybe she did want to show these wolves that she could stand beside him. Maybe she wanted to prove it to herself too. They lingered a while, observing the pack as the evening wore on. Some parted to sleep, others gathered in small groups to talk in hushed tones, the flickering torches casting dancing shadows. The drumming continued intermittently, an undercurrent of primal rhythm that reminded Mira of how old and deep these traditions ran. Eventually the crowd thinned enough that Kieran led her back inside the lodge, where a quiet hush reigned. The communal areas were nearly empty now, except for a few stragglers sharing a late meal. Outside her bedroom door, Kieran paused, his hand still resting lightly at her elbow. "I know it's only been a few days, but you've faced a lot of challenges. I want you to know I appreciate your resilience." She looked up at him, noting the lines of strain around his eyes. She realized he'd been under immense pressure to risking his leadership, juggling the elders' expectations, worrying about Rowan's looming presence. Suddenly, her frustration at him for choosing her without her consent warred with a surprising surge of empathy. "I won't lie," she said, voice subdued. "I'm still upset about how this all happened, but She took a breath. "But I see that you're carrying a huge burden, and I'm trying to understand." A trace of relief softened his features. Before she could step into her room, he bowed his head slightly, a gesture of gratitude. "Thank you, Mira." Then he withdrew, leaving her alone in the narrow corridor, her thoughts spinning in restless circles. She closed the door behind her, leaning against it as she exhaled. Her chest felt tight with emotion. Tonight had been a critical turning point, one that left her teetering between acceptance and doubt. She didn't yet know if she could truly become their Luna, but she was starting to realize that refusing outright would come at a steep price. And not only because of Rowan's threat. Something within her was coming alive in this place of shadows and moonlight, in the presence of Kieran's commanding yet somehow protective aura. Whether that was destiny or some fierce new longing, she didn't know, but it had begun to weave itself into her very bones. Sleep was slow in coming, her mind churning with the echo of the drums, the flicker of torchlight, and the memory of facing so many wolfish gazes. She dreamed again of running through a moonlit forest, only this time she was not alone. She sensed the presence of a large dark wolf at her side guiding her, matching her pace, its eyes glinting gold-green in the darkness. The next days blurred into a routine that pulled Mira deeper into pack life. She spent mornings helping in the kitchens or shadowing Amara during her patrol shifts. By observing, she gained an appreciation for how cohesive the pack was, each member slipping into roles that contributed to the collective's well-being. Some tended vegetable gardens, others scouted the perimeter, still others took on carpentry or tool-making. It was a self-sufficient society nestled in the wilderness, connected by instincts and shared purpose. When she had a spare moment, she'd slip away to read from the sparse bookshelf in her room or wander quietly along the forest paths. Though her sense of belonging was still tentative, she found that people were starting to greet her with cautious nods or even small smiles instead of outright suspicion. On the third morning after the gathering, she woke earlier than usual, a strange premonition of tension buzzing in her veins. The pack's settlement felt unnaturally silent. She dressed quickly and hurried outside, noticing how clusters of werewolves were gathered in heated discussion near the gates. Bryce stood at the forefront, scanning the tree line. Sensing something amiss, she jogged over. "What's going on?" she asked breathlessly, tugging her jacket closed. Bryce's sharp grey eyes cut to her, and he hesitated before answering. "There was an incident on the northern border last night. 2 of our patrols encountered intruders wolves who matched the description of Rowan's pack." A jolt of alarm ran through her. "Were they hurt?" "Battered, but alive," Bryce said, his tone grim. "The intruders fled after a brief skirmish, but it's clear they were testing our defenses. They didn't venture too far in. Likely scouts." Mira's stomach churned. This was the reality she'd stepped into. The possibility of violence at any moment. "Where's Kieran?" "He's already gone to check on our wounded and organize a response," Bryce replied, glancing at her. "You'd best stay near the lodge. We may need to lock down the territory if things escalate." A tense hush hung over the settlement for much of the day as scouts returned, reporting footprints, bent foliage, and other signs that a group of hostile wolves had prowled the borders. No one could confirm Rowan's presence personally, but the suspicion was strong. Kieran was in constant motion, conferring with elders, organizing patrol rotations, and ensuring that the entire pack was on alert. Mira caught only glimpses of him, always from a distance, always wearing the expression of a leader torn between protectiveness and the duty to remain strong for his people. By late afternoon, the tension had reached a fever pitch. Several more scouts dashed in, breathless, claiming they'd encountered fresh scents, fresh tracks. The pack settlement braced itself, uncertain if a larger assault was imminent. Mira stayed close to the lodge, watching from a window as Bryce, Amara, and 6 fighters disappeared into the forest, presumably to confront or chase off any lingering hostiles. Twilight began to cloak the treetops. The thick canopy cast the clearing in deep shadows, broken only by the glow of torches that a few pack members kept lit. Mira stood by the main entrance, arms wrapped around herself, a swirl of anxiety and helplessness coursing through her. She was no werewolf warrior. She couldn't join a patrol to defend these people. Her presence here felt strange. Was she just in the way? Suddenly, a chorus of howls rent the air, echoing through the forest. Her heart butted. She'd heard howling before, sometimes at night. When the pack remed, but this was different, laced with urgency and warning. In the next breath, she saw shapes moving between the trees, flickers of fur. Several of the pack's fighters came racing into the clearing, some on 2 legs, others half-shifting as they bounded forward. She caught sight of Quinn, blood streaking his forearm, panting as he called over his shoulder. "They're coming! Ruin's packet's not a scouting party this time. They're pushing in." Panic gripped the settlement. Women hustled children indoors, while the fighters bared their teeth, readying for a confrontation. Mira's pulse roared in her ears. She glanced around for Kieran, but he was nowhere in sight. Another wave of howls resonated through the trees, and she realized, with dawning horror, that these howls were not the voices of her pack, rather, the rival wolves. A challenge. A threat. In a flurry of motion, Bryce appeared, shifting partially. His eyes glowed gold, fur sprouted along his arms, and his fingers lengthened into deadly claws. "Rowan's making a direct move," he growled, addressing those still in human form. "They forced Amara and the others to fall back. We hold them here until Kieran returns." Chaos rippled as pack members scrambled into defensive positions around the clearing. Some shifted fully, thick-furred wolves bracing, hackles raised. Others remained partly human, able to communicate more easily. Mira stood on the lodge's porch, trembling from head to toe. Her instincts screamed for her to hide. She had no training, no weapons. But she couldn't tear her eyes away from the tree line. Suddenly, a deep snarl burst from the shadows, and a massive wolf lunged into the clearing. Even in the dim torchlight, Mira could see the routed scar across its muzzle, the hatred gleaming in its eyes. More wolves followed, spreading out in a half-circle, confronting Bryce and the handful of defenders. For a heartbeat, time seemed to freeze. Then both sides clashed in a blur of fur, fangs, claws, and shouts. Mira gasped as the fight erupted. She saw Bryce engage 2 wolves at once, his teeth bared in a snarl, clawed hands raking through fur. Another pack member, still in human form, swung the makeshift club, connecting with a sickening thud against an attacker's flank. The intruder yelped but lunged again, snapping viciously. It was a frenzy of violence that made her heart pound in terror. She spotted Quinn, limping as he tried to fend off a snarling wolf bigger than he was. Without thinking, she grabbed a sturdy stick from the ground and rushed forward, adrenaline surging. She had no illusions about her strength, but she couldn't stand by and watch a friend be torn apart. Hard hammering, she swung the stick at the assailant's flank, shouting in desperation to distract it. The wolf jerked away from Quinn, turning blazing eyes on her. She froze, mouth going dry. In that instant, she saw those savage teeth, smelled the rank odor of blood. It lunged for her, jaws wide. A blur of movement, interven a dark-haired figure tackled the beast mid-leap, sending it tumbling across the ground. Mira recognized the fierce eyes. Kieran. He had arrived. Relief flooded her even as she stumbled back, trying to catch her breath. Kieran and the enemy wolf rolled, snapping and growling. He shifted partially, clawed hands and elongated canines giving him an edge in close quarters. In a rapid flurry of blows, he forced the intruder down, delivering a final slash that left the wolf staggering away with a pained whine. A sudden hush fell as more of Kieran's fighters, presumably rallied by his arrival, poured into the clearing, outnumbering the intruders. Several of Rowan's wolves took one look at the new wave of defenders and peeled off, dashing back toward the shadows. One by one, the remaining attackers realized the fight was turning, and they fled, leaving behind only groans, the tang of blood in the air, and battered bodies panting on the ground. Mira collapsed to her knees, the makeshift stick dropping from her numbed fingers. Her lungs burned, and her mind reeled from the violence she'd just witnessed. Kieran hurried to her side, kneeling. Blood smeared his arm, but she couldn't tell if it was his or an enemy's. His eyes gleamed with worry. "You're hurt?" She shook her head, though her whole body trembled. "I may fine. I almost day." She swallowed the knot in her throat. Quinn needed help. Kieran glanced around and spotted Quinn, who was being tended to by another pack member. "You're brave," he murmured, brushing hair from her face. "But you should have stayed back." Tears pricked her eyes, not from physical pain, but from the sheer intensity of the moment. "I couldn't just watch," she whispered. He exhaled slowly, then pulled her upright, supporting her against him. Around them, the pack surveyed the damage. Several werewolves were injured, but it appeared no one had died. Rowan's pack had retreated for now. Kieran's hold on Mira tightened protectively, and she could sense the tension rolling off him in waves, a mixture of fury at the attack and relief that it had been repelled. A low growl rumbled from Bryce, who was back on his feet, though he sported a nasty gash across his chest. "They timed this well," he said, voice hoarse. "Struck fast. Tried to catch us off guard." Kieran's lips parted in a snarl. "They wanted to see if we were weak or divided after the announcement that I chose a human mate." He looked down at Mira, eyes full of regret and anger at the same time. Rowan thought he could exploit the pack's doubts, but we held. Caliana approached, cloak askew, her stern face etched with concern. "This won't be the last attack," she said grimly. "Rowan won't give up so easily." Kieran nodded, releasing Mira to address the elder. "Strengthen the perimeter. Set double patrols at night. We'll gather the pack for a meeting at first light. Coordinate a more thorough strategy." He turned back to Mira, his gaze lingering on her pale cheeks. "You should rest," he said softly. "This was your first real taste of our world's brutality. No one can blame you if you're shaken." She opened her mouth, wanting to protest that she was strong enough to handle it. But in truth, her trembling hands betrayed her. She gave a tiny nod, following his suggestion. Her head whirled with 1,000 thoughts. The raw violence she'd witnessed, the sense that Rowan's pack was just getting started, and the realization that she had stepped in to protect Quinn with barely a second thought. Her battered emotions warred with a strange flicker of pride. Despite her fear, she had tried to help. Kieran escorted her back into the lodge, stopping in the corridor just outside her room. "Let me see your arms," he murmured, gently turning her wrists over. "Any scratches? Bites?" She shook her head, blinking back tears. "No, I don't think so." He exhaled in relief. "Good. If you'd been bitten or scratched badly, we'd have to worry about infection or, worse, partial turning, though that's rare and complicated for humans." The thought made her stomach churn. "I'm fine," she whispered. "Just as shaken." He nodded, stepping back to give her space. "Take the night to recover. I'll check on you later." She managed a small, grateful smile, though her mind was still in chaos. "Thank you." He left, presumably to see to the wounded and reassure the rest of the pack. Mira pushed open her door, shut it behind her, and slid down to the floor, pressing her back against the wood. The adrenaline that had been sustaining her drained away, replaced by an ache in her muscles and a swirl of emotion so intense she could barely contain it. She had witnessed an actual werewolf skirmish, had nearly been attacked herself. And yet, what haunted her most was the knowledge that this was only the beginning. Rowan wouldn't let up just because his scouts had retreated tonight. He would keep testing, keep pushing, until he found a way to break the Lunar Eclipse Pack's unity. And she was a key point of contention. Rowan knew the pack had an unorthodox alpha's mate. By targeting them, he could rattle their sense of security, maybe even drive them to reject her in fear that her presence was the root cause of this trouble. The possibility made her chest constrict. She was torn between wanting to flee for her own safety and wanting to stay, to stand beside these people who had welcomed her in their own complicated way. Standing up for Quinn had awakened something fierce in her, a glimmer of the resolve she might need if she truly became their Luna. For a long time, she sat there in the hush of her room, letting her thoughts swirl. If she was to remain, she had to accept the reality of potential bloodshed, the necessity of defending territory against rival packs who showed no mercy. Was she ready for that? Could she embrace that risk, not just for Kieran but for the pack as a whole? Eventually, exhaustion claimed her. She crawled into bed fully clothed, drifting into a fitful sleep where she dreamed of snarling wolves and flashes of red moonlight, of Kieran's eyes amid the chaos, anchoring her even as darkness threatened to engulf everything. Dawn broke, subdued and gray, as though the sky itself mourned the violence of the night before. Mira awoke stiff and sore, her mind jolting to awareness of what had happened. She forced herself out of bed, tidying her rumpled clothes and splashing water on her face from a basin. Outside, she discovered a somber atmosphere. Injured werewolves were being treated with herbal salves. some lying on makeshift cots. Others moved about, fortifying the gates or carrying messages to the outlying parts of the territory. The entire settlement bristled with readiness, as though a second attack might come at any moment. She found Kieran in the large dining hall, conversing with Bryce, Amara, and Kaliana. They stood over a rough map spread across a table, marking points where the enemy had been sighted. Upon seeing her approach, Kieran gave her a brief nod, but his focus remained on strategy. "We'll rotate squads every 6 hours," Bryce was saying, tapping a line on the map. "And keep 2 watchers in the watchtowers overnight," Kaliana agreed, her voice flat. "Good. We must also prepare for Rowan to attempt sabotage or infiltration. He's cunning." Amara noticed Mira, gave her a curt greeting, then turned back to Kieran. "We should warn the edges of the human town. If Rowan decides to stir chaos there, it could cause panic, and we know humans might come poking around if they sense a threat." Kieran sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'll send a few discreet scouts to watch the roads near town. We can't afford a full exposure of our pack." Mira cleared her throat gently, drawing their attention. "Is there anything I can do?" The 4 of them looked at her, and in that brief moment, she felt the weight of being the outlier in a crisis situation that demanded werewolf cunning and strength. But she squared her shoulders, refusing to let self-doubt consume her. Kieran's expression softened fractionally. "You've already done enough by staying calm last night. Right now, the best thing is for you to stay safe. We can't risk Rowan getting the idea to target you again, especially if he believes harming you will weaken the pack's morale." A flicker of frustration sparked in her. "I don't want to just hide," she insisted. "I want to help somehow, even if it's just carrying supplies or tending to injuries." Amara gave a small shrug. "There are wounded who might appreciate help. Our usual caretakers could use extra hands, someone to bring water, fresh bandages, that sort of thing." Kaliana nodded. "Yes, human or wolf. It doesn't matter in a sick room. They need comfort. Relieved to have a role, however minor." Mira agreed. Moments later, she was ushered to a corner of the lodge that had been converted into a makeshift infirmary. The older woman, whose name she learned was Martha, was busy grinding herbs in a mortar and pestle. Martha's warm gaze settled on Mira with a hint of surprise, but she gave a kind nod when Mira offered to help. Together, they tended to cuts and scrapes, changed out bloodied bandages, and offered steaming cups of herbal tea to those with deeper wounds. Some werewolves eyed her warily, unused to receiving care from a human, but in pain and fatigue they accepted. Through it all, Mira discovered that focusing on the well-being of others steadied her own nerves. She wasn't a fighter, but she could give comfort and compassion. In the early afternoon, as she was helping a young wolf named Neil, who'd suffered a nasty gash on his thigh, Kieran stepped in. He paused at the threshold, observing her carefully. There was sweat on his brow, a sign he'd likely been running or sparring. Even so, the way he watched her soft and intent made her pulse skip. Finally, he moved closer. "Martha," he said, greeting the older healer politely, then shifted his attention to Mira. "May I have a word with you?" She nodded, placing the bowl of water aside. Stepping out into the hall, she followed him to a quiet alcove where a narrow window let in a shaft of pale sunlight. Her fingers felt cold, despite the day's warmth. Something in his demeanor spoke of gravity, a weighty decision. "Kieran?" she ventured, apprehension rising. "What's happened?" He exhaled, resting a palm against the stone wall. "Rowan's aggression won't stop. The question is not if he'll attack again, but when. The blood moon is 3 weeks away. Usually we'd spend this month focusing on the ceremonial aspects of the rite, But now we have to defend our borders. I've just learned from one of our spies that Rowan is gathering more allies, rogue wolves, possibly even a smaller pack to the north. He wants to strike soon, before we can fully unify. Fear twisted in her gut. What does that mean for us? He turned, fixing her with a somber gaze. It means we can't rely on tradition alone to protect us. Normally, the rite of the blood moon strengthens the Alpha's power, binding him and his mate to the pack, which in turn amplifies the pack's unity. The stronger that bond is, the harder it is for an outside force to break us. Rowan knows this. He's betting on your presence causing fractures. He might attempt to capture you, force a confrontation that could split the pack's loyalty. Her hands trembled slightly as she recalled last night's attack, how close she'd come to being mauled. What are you suggesting? He glanced away, jaw tight. If I wanted to protect you purely from a strategic standpoint, I might send you away far from here, somewhere Rowan couldn't find you. But I suspect he'd chase you regardless, just to prove a point, humiliate us. It's also not a one I want. His voice dipped, husky with emotion. I can't stand the thought of you being out there alone, unguarded. And there's another factor. If you were gone, the pack would lose faith in my decision, and the right would fail. Mira's heart pounded. So you want me to stay? Yes, he said, the single word resonating with quiet intensity. But more than that, we need to solidify our bond. I know I promised not to rush you, to let you decide on your own terms. But the circumstances have changed, Mira. If we finalize our mating bond before the blood moon, the pack will feel that unity sooner. It might be enough to withstand Rowan's next move and keep him from picking off our outliers one by one. She stared at him, her pulse roaring in her ears. Finalize you mean the full mate bond? His nod was solemn. Yes, the mock, the bond ceremony, both a part of the werewolf tradition, a ritual that seals our connection, forging a link that the pack can sense. It's also a potent source of strength for us both, physically and mentally. It's not something to be taken lightly, nor forced, but time is against us. A swirl of conflicting emotions churned inside her. Fear, longing, resentment, and the faint traitorous spark of curiosity about what that bond would feel like. She recalled the subtle magnetism she'd felt from the moment he first approached her. The sense of rightness whenever she stood near him, even amid the terror and confusion. Part of her ached to find out if that was real, if this bond could truly bind their hearts as well as their fates. But she also felt a deep sense of betrayal at the lack of a normal courtship, a chance to choose him simply because she wanted to, not because of external pressure. You're asking me to tie my life to yours forever, she said shakily, when I've only known you a few days. His gaze flickered with pain. I know, and it's selfish of me, but I can't see another way if we wait until the blood moon. Rowan might tear us apart before we even have a chance to stand firm. If we do it now, we present a united front showing the pack and Rowan that we won't be swayed. She pressed her palms against her forehead, trying to steady her thoughts. This is so unfair. Believe me, I understand. He reached out gently, brushing her arm. If it's any consolation, I do care for you, not just as a means to protect my pack. You've surprised me, Mira. Your courage, your wit, your empathy, they drew me in, long before I made my choice official. She swallowed hard, staring at the floor. And if I say no? He sighed, withdrawing his hand. That I won't force you. We'll try to hold off Rowan without the bond's strength, and we'll hope the pack doesn't fracture under the strain, but the risk will be enormous both to us and to your personal safety. She felt tears sting her eyes. born of frustration and a sense of being cornered. This was everything she'd feared, her choice overshadowed by the threat of violence, the burden of pack tradition, and Kieran's unwavering devotion to his people. Yet, looking up at him, she saw genuine anguish in his expression. He wasn't manipulating her for sport. He was caught, too, forced into an impossible position by an ancient rivalry and a tradition that demanded the alpha seal his leadership with a mate. Maybe he should have chosen one of his she-wolves, yes, but he hadn't. And now, here they were both paying the price for his decision. "I can't give you an answer right this second," she managed, voice husky. "I need time to think." He nodded slowly. "Of course. I'm sorry, I know it's a lot. Take what time you can, but understand that we might not have much." With that, he inclined his head, stepping away to rejoin Bryce and the others, leaving her standing in the narrow slice of sunlight, her thoughts in turmoil. She spent the rest of the day in a haze, splitting her time between helping in the infirmary and retreating to her room whenever the weight of uncertainty became too much. Twice, Amara came by to deliver more bandages and gave her a questioning look, as if sensing Mira's distress. But Mira wasn't sure she could confide in anyone about the choice she now faced. It wasn't just about forging a supernatural bond with Kieran. It was about accepting an entire life bound up in a werewolf pack's battles, traditions, and future. If she consented to the bond, there'd be no easy return to the solitary comfort of her old life. She'd be Luna, mate to an alpha, expected to stand her ground under a blood moon that demanded loyalty and resolve. Evening fell, and the tension around the settlement remained thick enough to slice. No new attacks came, but the howls that echoed at intervals through the trees set everyone's nerves on edge. Mira, exhausted from the day, finally slipped outside the lodge to a small bench near the courtyard, seeking a moment of quiet. The autumn breeze stirred fallen leaves, carrying the scent of pine and fading sunlight. She rubbed her arms, trying to ward off the chill. Her thoughts drifted to an image she couldn't quite shake. The expression on Kieran's face when he'd asked her to consider the mate bond. The anguish that lay just beneath his determination. For all his alpha strength, he was as trapped by circumstance as she was. And what about the flicker of belonging she'd felt when she stepped forward to protect Quinn? The sense that she was, in some small way, part of them? Footsteps sounded behind her. She glanced over her shoulder to see Bryce, still sporting a bandage on his chest, leaning casually against a post. His gaze was level, not unkind. "Mind if I join you?" She scooted to one side of the bench. "Sure." He lowered himself onto the other end with a quiet sigh. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he cleared his throat. "You did good last night," he said. "Helping Quinn. He's a stubborn pup, but he's grateful." Mira gave a wry smile. "I don't know how helpful I really was. I almost got myself eaten." Bryce shrugged. "Still, you tried. Most humans would have run screaming." She stared at the ground, her tone subdued. "Sometimes I think maybe I should." A faint grin curved his lips. "I'm glad you haven't." They lapsed into silence again, and Mira wondered if Bryce was here on Kieran's behalf, trying to gauge her mindset. At length he said, "You're worried about the bond, aren't you?" She turned, startled that he'd cut straight to the heart of it. "It's that obvious?" He let out a rough chuckle. "The Alpha's been different lately. I can guess what's on his mind. I also see you walking around like there's a heavy weight on your shoulders. It's not hard to put two and two together." She sighed. "I just don't know if I can do it. The mate bond is permanent, right? It's not like a casual engagement you can walk away from." "Werewolves mate for life," Bryce said quietly, his tone carrying a certain reverence. When an alpha chooses, it's even more binding because of the pack's energy feeding into it. You'd be tied to us in a way no human can fully fathom. Shared instincts, heightened emotions. It can be overwhelming. She nodded, her throat tight. That's what I'm afraid of. But if I say no, I leave everyone vulnerable. True enough, Bryce acknowledged. Rowan's counting on you to be uncertain, on the pack to remain half-hearted about your presence. But if you commit, wholeheartedly, the pack will rally behind you and Kieran. It's how we're wired. He paused, adding more gently, but you deserve to choose for yourself. Kieran knows that. She folded her arms, hugging herself against the chill. Have you known Kieran long, Bryce? He nodded. We grew up together. When his father died, the burden of leadership fell on Kieran. He was still so young. I watched him shoulder that responsibility and never complain, even when it tore him up inside. I became his beta to help carry a piece of that load, but there are things only an alpha can do, like the blood moon rite. He's tried to follow tradition as best he can, but something in him refuses to take the expected path if it doesn't feel right. Clearly, that path led him to you. Mara thought about the quiet earnestness in Kieran's eyes, how he'd apologized for the abruptness of his choice, and how he risked losing everything if she refused him. He deserves someone who's sure of what they want, she murmured. Someone who doesn't flinch at the sight of blood, who can actually fight alongside him. Bryce smiled slightly. Don't underestimate yourself, Mira. Courage isn't about not flinching, it's about flinching and still standing. And as for surety, well, you have a strong heart. Maybe that's all that matters. As for the rest, you can learn. The pack's not so rigid that we can't teach you if you're willing. Her eyes stung with unshed tears. I'm torn, she admitted in a near whisper. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a simple gesture of camaraderie. No one can decide but you, but if you're looking for a sign, consider the fact that you're still here, wanting to help, even after seeing how brutal our world can be. She took in a shaky breath, letting his words sink in. Despite everything, she hadn't run. The idea of leaving filled her with a hollow dread. The few days she'd spent among them, tense, terrifying, and yet strangely fulfilling, had awakened something inside her, a sense of belonging she'd never felt before. Perhaps she'd been on the edge of the supernatural world her entire life for a reason. Maybe this was where she was always meant to be. They sat a while longer, the hush of twilight broken by distant calls of wolves securing the territory. Eventually Bryce excused himself to check on the patrols, and Mira remained on the bench, studying the moon that rose through a drift of clouds. It was just a silver crescent now, but in a few weeks it would be full and red with the blood moon's aura. By then, a final decision would be made, one that could shape her life forever. Deep in the night, after everyone else had settled or gone to their posts, Mira found herself outside once again, drawn to the quiet forest. She walked a short distance from the lodge, letting the silver glow of moonlight guide her. She reached a mossy clearing where the trees parted, revealing a large patch of sky studded with stars. The hush here was profound, broken only by the gentle creak of branches. She tried to calm her racing thoughts by focusing on the beauty of the night. Behind her, the soft snap of a twig made her whirl around. Her heart jumped to her throat. For a moment, she feared an intruder from Rowan's pack. But then she saw Kieran step into the clearing, his movements live and almost soundless. Relief flooded her system. His gaze caught hers, revealing surprise at finding her here. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, he approached with measured steps, stopping an arm's length away. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked in a quiet tone. She shook her head. "Too much in my mind." A shaky laugh escaped her lips. "I guess that's obvious." He studied her in the dim light, the planes of his face sculpted by moonbeams. "I'm sorry," he murmured, "for the pressure you're under. I wish I could give you a normal life, or at least a normal courtship, if that's what you'd want." She ran a hand over her hair, exhaling. "I know you do." A breeze ruffled the leaves overhead, sending a rustling whisper through the clearing. Kieran hesitated, then said, "May I show you something?" He gestured to the deeper woods beyond, where old pines stretched their branches skyward like silent sentinels. Mira glanced at him warily. "It's late. I'll keep you safe," he said, that familiar confidence in his voice. "I promise." She paused, then nodded. Something about him at that moment was gentle, almost vulnerable. She followed him along a narrow, twisting path, her eyes adjusting to the moonlit shadows. The forest embraced them in an earthy hush. Occasionally, the distant hoot of an owl broke the silence, or the soft scurry of night creatures rustled the undergrowth. After a while, the path opened onto a small, moonlit pond, its surface rippling with silver reflections of the sky. A wooden dock jutted out over the water, worn with age. Kieran led her to the dock, stepping lightly onto the planks. The water lapped softly against the wood. He stopped near the edge, gazing at the shimmering reflection of the crescent moon, then turned to her. "I used to come here when I was a boy," he said, his voice low, carrying memories. "When the weight of the pack's future felt too much, my mother would bring me, and we'd listen to the water. It's the one place I feel like I can breathe." She moved beside him, noting how peaceful the pond was, a stark contrast to the constant readiness back at the settlement. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He nodded. "Yes." Then he drew in a careful breath. "I asked you here because I wanted to do something I haven't done properly since this all began." Slowly, he turned to face her fully, his eyes capturing hers. "I wanted to ask you, not as an alpha fulfilling a duty, but as a mana, would you consider becoming my mate? Not because it's forced upon us, but because I believe we can face this life together." Her heart constricted. "Kieran." He reached out and, when she didn't pull away, took her hands in his. His voice was quiet, but steady. "I won't lie. I want you by my side. I feel something for you I've never felt for anyone else. It's as if a part of me recognized you before I even knew your name. But I need you to want this as well, in whatever small way you can right now. I can't promise our life will be easy. Rowan's threat looms, and the pack will need us both, but I can promise I will stand with you, protect you, and respect you until my last breath." Mira's eyes stung with tears. She felt the sincerity in his words, the vulnerability he rarely showed. She recalled the swirl of impressions from these past days, how he'd appeared on her doorstep, how she'd raged at him, how he'd quietly let her see the truth of his world. She remembered the comforting weight of his presence when the pack gathered, the surge of relief when he saved her from the rival wolf. And she recalled the sense of belonging, however nascent, growing inside her each time she braved the pack's doubt to help them. She swallowed. "I'm scared," she admitted, voice trembling. "This is all so huge, but I also can't imagine running away from it now. I want to see what this bond could be. I want to see if, together, we can stand against whatever comes next." His exhale was ragged, relief and hope flooding his face. "Then say yes," he murmured, stepping closer. The warmth of him surrounded her, the pine and smoke scent she'd come to associate with him curling around her senses. "Let me mark you, complete the ritual. We'll face Rowan, the blood moon, and the pact together." A deep shiver ran through her. Marking. She'd read in old legends that a werewolf's mate bond could involve a bite at the juncture of the neck or shoulder, infused with supernatural energy that sealed the connection. The thought both thrilled and terrified her, but she recognized it as part of the vow Kieran was asking for. "Will it hurt?" she whispered. His voice was gentle. "It can sting at first, but if done with care, it's also intensely intimate. Our energies will mingle. You'll feel me, and I'll feel you." He brushed a thumb over her knuckles. "In our pack, the full ceremony is usually held under the blood moon, with the entire pack as witnesses. But we can do a private marking first, to strengthen our bond now. Then, under the blood moon, we'll formalize it before everyone. Pull." Mira's pulse thrummed. She thought of the life she'd known, simple, human, unremarkable. Then she thought of Kieran and the shimmering pond reflecting starlight, the pack that needed unity, the fierce battles that might lie ahead. She stepped closer, resting a hand against his chest, feeling his heart hammer beneath her palm. "All right," she breathed, barely audible. "Yes." His eyes closed for a moment, as though absorbing the enormity of her consent. Then, gently, he guided her arms around his waist. "I promise I'll be careful," he said, voice hushed. "Let me know if it's too much, and I'll stop." She nodded, her throat tight, every sense magnified by anticipation. The moon above seemed to pulse in the darkness, and the forest around them went still, as though nature itself held its breath. Kieran bent his head, pressing his forehead to hers. Slowly he trailed kisses along her jaw, moving to the curve of her neck. Her skin tingled at the closeness of his lips, the warmth of his breath. Then she felt the barest scrape of his teeth against the sensitive spot where her neck met her shoulder, just above her collarbone. Her heart thundered. She tensed, half in fear, half in a delirious surge of longing. Kieran's arms tightened around her, his breath turning ragged, and in one smooth motion he bit down, a mingling of pain and electric heat searing through her. She gasped, fingers digging into his back. For an instant, her vision blurred with starbursts, her body both recoiling from the shock and melting into an indescribable wave of connection. She felt more than physical sensation, she felt Kieran's spirit, or perhaps the essence of his wolf, flooding into her, seeking her. It was as if a rush of primal power surged through her veins, igniting a bond that locked onto something deep within her soul. Suddenly, she was aware of his heartbeat echoing in her own chest, a reflection of his emotions, protective, ardent, trembling with the weight of the moment. Pain mingled with the stark thrill of union, forging a link that pulsed like a second heartbeat. Kieran withdrew his fangs, pressing his mouth gently over the wound to stanch the trickle of blood. The sting persisted, but in its wake was a deep, steady warmth. She became aware of his ragged breathing against her skin, and the soft glow that seemed to envelop them both. Through the haze of sensation, she heard him whisper her name, voice thick with awe and relief. Slowly, she lifted her head to meet his gaze. His eyes shone in the moonlight, reflecting that strange color somewhere between gold and green. Yet now there was a new luminosity that seemed to mirror what she felt inside. He lifted a hand to her cheek, brushing away a tear she hadn't realized she'd shed. "Mira," he said quietly, almost reverently. Are you?" She nodded, lips trembling into a shaky smile. "Yes, I'm all right. More than all right." Because despite the pain, despite the swirl of adrenaline, she felt a sense of wholeness she'd never imagined possible. It was like stepping into a hidden current, letting it carry her into a realm where her heartbeat was no longer hers alone. He drew her into a tender embrace, breathing in her scent now laced with his own mark. "Thank you," he murmured, voice cracking with emotion. "I swear I'll do everything to protect you and us." Leaning into him, the moonlit pond shimmering behind them, she closed her eyes and let the bond settle. A distant part of her was terrified of what lay ahead: Rowan's aggression, the pack's scrutiny, the final blood moon ceremony that would publicly affirm her as Luna. But for this moment, here in the hush of a starlit clearing, she allowed herself to feel the fierce, unbreakable connection that had formed between them. Kieran pressed his cheek to the top of her head, exhaling a long, shaky breath. And together, under the silent canopy of ancient pines, they stood as one, newly bound in an act that transcended all boundaries of human and wolf, forging a promise that neither time nor threat could easily sever. The days following Mira's private marking were a whirlwind of change. Overnight, a shift rippled through the pack, as though they could sense the new energy connecting their alpha to the human he had chosen. Though the official ceremony still awaited the blood moon, the partial bond was enough to send tremors of awareness through the pack bond, a phenomenon that boosted morale in the face of Rowan's menacing presence. Some pack members claimed they could feel a stabilizing influence, a reminder that even in chaos, their alpha had found a mate willing to stand by him. Others viewed it warily, uncertain if a human could truly contribute to their collective strength. But no one could deny that the intangible link between Kieran and Mira had grown. Mira herself felt the bond in surprising ways. Sometimes she caught flickers of Kieran's emotions, a surge of worry, a flash of protectiveness, even moments of unguarded tenderness like faint echoes in her own mind. She caught him staring at her more often, as though confirming she was still all right. And at night, when she tried to rest, she'd sometimes feel a phantom warmth against her skin, a residual memory of his bite and the primal current that had coursed between them. It was both exhilarating and disconcerting. She found herself yearning for closeness to soothe the confusion, and yet she fought to maintain her sense of self, refusing to lose her identity in the swirl of supernatural intensity. Meanwhile, Rowan's pack remained a looming threat. Patrols continued to report sightings along the border. Minor skirmishes flared up, but nothing on the scale of the ambush they'd suffered days ago. It seemed Rowan was testing them, waiting for an opening. Bryce insisted that Rowan might be planning something big as the full moon drew nearer, hoping to strike before Kieran and Mira completed the rite of the blood moon. If Rowan could disrupt or sabotage that ceremony, he might shatter the lunar eclipse pack's unity and swoop in for a decisive victory. In response, Kieran and the elders rallied the pack to bolster defenses. They established rotating patrol shifts, posted watchers in hidden vantage points, and drilled daily in combat tactics. Even Mira found herself roped into basic self-defense lessons. Amara, stoic as ever, took on the role of instructor, teaching Mira how to brace herself, how to use an attacker's momentum against them, and how to escape a chokehold. Mira wasn't sure she'd ever be on par with a full werewolf's strength, but knowing a few moves steadied her nerves. Late one afternoon, after a taxing training session in which Amara had tossed her onto a mat more times than she cared to count, Mira rubbed her bruised arms and headed back to the lodge. She wanted nothing more than a hot shower and a quiet moment to herself. But as she reached the main hall, she saw Kieran waiting. He offered a faint, apologetic smile, motioning her over. "I hate to interrupt your plans," he said, "but Kaliana wants to see us." Mara groaned inwardly. The elders had treated her civilly since she began helping in the infirmary, but there was still a persistent sense of formality whenever they summoned her. Did she say why? He shook his head. Just that we needed to discuss the upcoming ceremony and certain preparations. Her stomach clenched. She recalled that the Rite of the Blood Moon was a grand event, heavily codified by tradition. The private marking they'd done by the moonlit pond was an emotional bond, but not an official one. The ceremony itself required the elders' blessing. They'd do it at the heart of the pack's territory, typically under the open sky when the blood moon reached its zenith. That was still 2 weeks away, but apparently the elders had decided to expedite the planning. She sighed. "All right, lead the way." They found Kaliana in one of the smaller sitting rooms, decorated with woven tapestries of wolves running beneath moon phases. Lamps glowed with warm light, illuminating the older woman's stern face. 2 other elders sat nearby, the bearded man named Herrick, who had questioned Mira during the gathering, and a 3rd elder named Safia, a woman with intricately braided hair streaked in silver. All 3 looked up as Kieran and Mira entered. "Good, you're here," Kaliana said, motioning for them to sit. Mira lowered herself onto a wooden stool, while Kieran stood behind her, his presence a reassuring anchor. Kaliana cleared her throat. "We'll be direct. We've sensed the partial bond forming between you 2. While this is unusual, it's not unheard of for the Alpha to mark his chosen mate before the official rite. However, the rest of the ceremony cannot be taken lightly. You must adhere to the sacred customs if you wish to complete the bond with the full blessing of the pack." Herrick leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "That means performing the vow exchange, sealed by the blood moon's power. Usually, we keep the details hidden from outsiders until they prove themselves. But you, Mira, are in a unique position. We cannot wait. We must ensure you understand each step." Safia nodded. "The ceremony has 2 main parts. The lunar vow, where you both pledge loyalty to each other, and the pack under the moon's witness. And the transference, where the pack's energy flows through you, fully integrating you into our collective bond. Typically, that would happen naturally if you were a werewolf. But since you're human, we'll need to adapt the ritual to keep you safe. A full, unbridled energy surge might overwhelm you." Mira swallowed. The mention of a transference sent a jolt of apprehension through her. "Is this dangerous?" "Potentially," Herrick admitted. "Werewolves have a connection to lunar magic that we're born with. You do not. But with Kieran's guidance, and ours, you can anchor yourself properly." He flicked his gaze to Kieran. "The key is that you 2 must be in harmony. If you resist or panic, the energy could rebound." She stared at the elders, feeling a pang of anxiety. "Is there any chance I might lose myself? Or be harmed?" Kaliana pursed her lips. "It's rare, but not impossible. You'll feel the pull of the pack's combined power. Some humans simply can't handle it. But if Kieran's bond with you is strong, you'll have his strength to lean on." Her voice softened a fraction, as if in concession to how overwhelming it sounded. "This is why we rarely allow a human to join the pack in this manner. But these are extraordinary times." Mira glanced up at Kieran. His jaw was tense, eyes unwavering. "I'll guide you," he murmured. "You won't be alone." She nodded, a flutter of fear mingling with a strange, unshakable resolve. I understand. Safia tapped her fingers on a carved wooden staff that lay across her lap. Furthermore, we have word that Rowan may attempt to sabotage the rite. Rumors suggest he's gathering an alliance of rogues who resent the Lunar Eclipse Pact's influence. If that's true, he might try to storm our territory during the ceremony, or lure some of our own to betray us. A cold knot formed in Mira's stomach. She recalled the savage glint in those wolves' eyes during the ambush, the knowledge that Rowan saw her as a key vulnerability. What can we do? Kaliana's gaze went to Kieran. We must fortify our defenses. Only a select few guardians will be allowed in the ceremonial circle. The rest of the pack will form a perimeter. But the rite cannot be cancelled or postponed. The blood moon comes on May, its own schedule, and if we miss it, we lose the chance to confirm the Alpha's leadership for another century. The pack can't survive that kind of upheaval right now. Mira's head spun. She'd known the ceremony was important, but hearing it spelled out so bluntly hammered home the stakes. If they failed to complete the ritual, Kieran's hold on the pack could weaken, and Rowan might descend like a vulture on carrion. The entire settlement could fall under a tyrannical, rival Alpha, with consequences too dark to imagine. Kieran finally spoke, voice firm. Then we move forward as planned. We'll double the patrols around the time of the blood moon, set hidden sentries in every approach. If Rowan dares strike, we'll meet him, but I'm not letting him keep me from fulfilling my duty to the Paycor, from standing beside my mate. His words sent a thrill through Mira, even as worry gnawed her insides. The elders exchanged glances. Herrick dipped his head in grudging respect. Very well, Alpha. We'll finalize the preparations. Sophia raised her staff slightly, the carved wolf's head at the top catching the lamplight. You both must be ready, body, mind, and spirit. Spend these next 2 weeks preparing yourselves. Strengthen your connection. The rite cannot succeed if your hearts are not aligned. Mira felt heat rise in her cheeks, aware that each elder was scrutinizing her for any sign of doubt. She forced her shoulders to square, meeting their gazes one by one. I'll do everything I can to be worthy of your trust, she said quietly. I won't let the pack down. She sensed approval in Kaliana's posture, even if the elder's face remained impassive. Good, she said. Then we'll speak again soon. Kieran thanked them briefly, then guided Mira out of the room. They walked in silence down the corridor, stopping only when they reached the wide porch that overlooked the clearing. Evening was drawing close, painting the sky in hues of purple and orange. Mira leaned against the wooden railing, trying to sort through the surge of emotion swirling inside her. Finally, Kieran placed a hand on her shoulder. I'm sorry it's so intense, he said softly. I knew the rite would be demanding, but I never imagined Rowan would escalate things to this level. She turned to him, her eyes searching his. What if we fail? What if I freeze up during this transference and break the ritual? Then all of you, your entire pack, might fall. His fingers slipped under her chin, tilting her face up. We will fail, he murmured, a confidence that was almost tangible. We have a bond now, and you're stronger than you think. She swallowed hard, pressing her hand over his. The link they shared throbbed faintly in her awareness. She could sense his determination, his fierce love for his people, and something else, a protectiveness directed at her, an unspoken vow that he'd shield her at all costs. I trust you, she admitted, voice low. And I'm trying to trust myself too. Gently he leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of him steady her. In that moment, she felt the gravity of her decision settle around her like a mantle. There was no turning back now. She would see this through, come what may. In the days that followed, Mira's life fell into a dual rhythm of preparation and vigilance. On one hand, she underwent deeper self-defense training, forcing her muscles and mind to adapt, spurred on by Amara's unrelenting drills. On the other, she attended quiet sessions with Kalyana or Sophia, who guided her through ancient rites meant to attune her to the pack's energy. Sometimes this involved chanting around a small fire, immersing her senses in the subtle hum of werewolf magic. Other times, it was a meditative exercise, focusing on her link with Kieran, learning to quiet her human fears and open herself to the lunar resonance that coursed through the territory. She also spent more time with Kieran, both intimately and emotionally. They took moonlit walks along the forest paths, hands entwined, speaking about their lives, their hopes, and their worries. He recounted stories of his childhood, how he'd wrestle with Amara in wolf form, or run through the pines with Bryce under the full moon. He told her about his father's final battle against a rogue pack that threatened the settlement, how the loss had shaped him into the Alpha he was today. Mira, in turn, shared her memories of reading stories late into the night at the bookstore, her parents' adventurous spirits, her lingering sadness at their passing, and the small joys she'd found in her quiet human life. Through these conversations, they forged a deeper understanding, building a bridge between their worlds. Often, their bond stirred with warmth, as if each word brought them closer to synchronizing heart and mind. Meanwhile, Rowan's presence weighed on everyone's thoughts. Scouts brought reports of renewed activity, mysterious footprints, glimpses of strange wolves at the perimeter. Yet no major attack occurred. Kieran suspected Rowan was biding his time, planning a decisive move on the night of the blood moon. Tension rose with each sunrise, a coiled spring waiting to snap. As the fateful night approached, the moon waxed fuller and fuller. Its glow intensified, shining in silver brilliance across the settlement. Werewolves grew more restless, their wolfish instincts stirred by the nearing lunar peak. Fights in the training yard became more intense, tempers flared more easily, and the entire territory buzzed with an undercurrent of both anticipation and dread. At last, the eve of the blood moon arrived. The sky was clear, the stars bright, and the moon hung pregnant with promise. Mira stood in her room, gazing out the window at the gleaming orb overhead. In less than 24 hours, it would be at its fullest, tinted red, like a celestial omen. Her palms felt clammy, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and terror. A soft knock sounded at the door. She turned, calling for the visitor to enter. Kieran slipped in, closing the door behind him. He looked different. Tonight there was a tension in his posture, yes, but also a quiet resolve. He wore a simple black shirt and pants, his hair slightly tousled as though he'd run his fingers through it in frustration. Without speaking, he crossed the room and drew her into his arms. She melted against him, relishing the steadiness of his heartbeat under her cheek. For a long time, they stood in silence. Then he spoke, voice subdued. "Tomorrow is the ceremony." She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Yes." His hands moved soothingly over her back. "The elders have finalized the arrangement. We'll gather in the main clearing at midnight. The pack will form a circle around us. You and I will stand at the center, and the vow will be spoken. Then the transference begins. Once it's complete, if all goes well, you'll be part of us in the truest sense, and I'll be bound to you, beyond anything that can be undone." His throat worked as he said that last part. She tightened her hold on him. And Rowan? He exhaled. We have watchers stationed. If he tries to launch an assault during the ceremony, we'll fight. But I'm hoping that if we can complete the rite quickly and unify the pack's energy, we'll repel any incursion. I only fear that Rowan might strike in the final moments when we're most vulnerable. Mira's stomach twisted. Do you want me to hold off on the transference if there's danger? A faint smile curved his lips. That would defeat the purpose. No, we need to see it through, no matter what. The pack can defend us in that crucial moment. Bryce, Amara, and the others will be ready. But if Rowan bursts in, trust me to keep you safe. She looked up at him, tears threatening. Kieran, I'm just as scared. Of so many things. Of failing. Of losing you. Of Rowan ripping this future away from us. He touched her cheek, brushing away a tear. I'm scared too, he admitted, voice husky. But we have each other. That's enough. She nodded, letting her head rest against his shoulder. Tomorrow, she would stand before the entire pack under the blood moon, speak vows in a language older than she'd ever known, and open herself to a wave of supernatural power that might either break or bind her forever. And beyond that circle, a cunning enemy lurked, ready to strike at their weakest point. It was like a scene from the myths she'd once read only. Now she was living it, heart pounding, soul on the line. Eventually, Kieran pressed a soft kiss to her temple. Try to rest, he whispered, guiding her to sit on the bed. I won't stay long. You have patrol duties tonight, but I'll see you in the morning. She nodded, blinking back tears of anxiety. Be careful. He offered a reassuring squeeze of her hand, then slipped out, leaving her alone in the hush of the room. It took her hours to drift into a fitful sleep, haunted by visions of crimson moonlight and fanged shadows moving in the dark. The day of the blood moon dawned unnaturally still, as though the forest itself held its breath. Pack members moved quietly, saving their energy for the night to come. There was no forced merriment or feasting, only calm, purposeful activity, with everyone knowing the ceremony would define their future. Mira spent the morning in final preparations with Safia, who helped her dress in a simple white tunic embroidered with subtle lunar motifs. It's customary for the Alpha's mate to wear white at the rite, Safia explained gently, her wise eyes shining with a hint of pride. We believe it symbolizes openness to the moon's blessing. Mira ran her fingers over the delicate stitching, feeling awkward. I'm not used to wearing ceremonial clothes. Safia offered a small smile. Few humans do in our world, but perhaps you were always meant for it. The elder then handed Mira a bracelet braided from thin leather strips, adorned with small moonstone beads. Wear this. It's an heirloom from our pack's earliest Desa protection charm, said to guide the Luna's steps. Touched by the gesture, Mira slipped the bracelet on. Thank you, she whispered. I hope I can live up to the role. In the afternoon, she found a moment alone to visit the infirmary, where a few still recovered from Rowan's earlier attacks. She offered them water, checked bandages, and tried to calm her nerves by focusing on the practical task of caring for others. Some of the injured wolves, those who had once eyed her with suspicion now, greeted her with quiet respect, sensing she was about to take on a great responsibility. Their acceptance buoyed her spirits. Maybe, just maybe, she was proving she could be one of them. Night fell like an oncoming tide, inexorable and profound. The moon rose steadily in the sky, bigger and rounder than Mira had ever seen it. Its hue was a deepening red, as though stained by ancient prophecies. One by one, Torches were lit around the main clearing, casting flickering light over the ring of carved wooden posts that marked the ceremonial space. Pack members assembled, forming a wide circle, hush prevailing except for the crackle of flames. The tension was almost unbearable, every breath drawn in collected anticipation. Kieran stood at the center, dressed in simple dark attire that contrasted with her white. A silver armband circled one bicep, etched with runic symbols. His gaze found her as she stepped forward, guided by Sophia. A hush passed through the pack, parted by her progress like water around a pebble. When she reached him, the swirling in her belly intensified, but she drew strength from the connection they'd forged. Sophia and Kalyana stood on either side, raising their arms in a gesture of invocation. A low chant began, picked up by Herrick and the other elders, the cadence matching the rhythmic pounding of a drum somewhere behind the crowd. The sound vibrated in Mira's chest, echoing her thudding heart. Kieran reached for her hands, their fingers intertwining. The chanting rose, weaving a tapestry of ancient power around them. "Mira Carter," he said, voice steady but tinged with awe. "Under this blood moon, do you offer yourself to this bond, to stand as Luna of the Lunar Eclipse Pack, bound to me and our people?" She swallowed her fear, focusing on the love and determination in his eyes. "I do," she answered, her voice trembling but resolute. "I stand with you, Kieran, and with your Hour Pack." The chanting swelled in volume. Sophia placed her staff between them, carved wolf's head pointed skyward. "Kieran, Alpha of the Lunar Eclipse Pack, do you claim Mira as your mate and Luna, to protect and honor until your final breath?" He spoke without hesitation, his voice ringing clear. "I do. She is my chosen, my equal, bound by fate and will." A hush spread among the Packvis was the final affirmation they'd been waiting for. Mira felt the drumming of 100 hearts in that silence. Kalyana stepped forward, sprinkling a handful of herbs into the torches. A fragrant smoke curled upward, drifting into the circle. "Then let the transference begin," she declared, her voice resonating with solemn authority. A ripple of energy stirred, brushing against Mira's senses like a wave. She gasped as it swept through her, carried by the chanting and the collective will of the pack. Kieran's grip on her hands tightened. She clung to him as the wave grew stronger, an otherworldly thrum that made the hair on her arms stand on end. The reflection of the blood moon in his eyes glowed with uncanny intensity. "Mira," he murmured, "focus on me. Let it flow through you." His presence was an anchor in a rising storm of power. She closed her eyes, letting the synergy of the chanting, the swirling smoke, and the pack's energy merge with her own. Slowly, she felt the bond between her and Kieran expand, as though invisible threads reached out from him to the pack, then looped back, threading through her. The sensation was dizzying, a surge that made her want to gasp for breath. Yet as fear threatened to rise, she remembered her training Amara's constant drilling on controlling emotions, Sophia's meditations on acceptance. She steadied herself, exhaling slowly. Within the swirling current of magic, she felt the presence of countless werewolves, some she knew well, others merely by sight. Their loyalty to Kieran, their struggles, their hopes, all brushed against her consciousness, like a million voices in the dark. For an instant, it overwhelmed her, a cacophony too vast to bear. She wavered on her feet, swaying. "Mira!" Kieran's voice cut through, sharp with concern. "Stay with me." Clenching her jaw, she latched onto that mental thread linking them. She concentrated on the quiet moments they'd shared, the whispered confessions of fear and longing, the sense of safety in his arms. Gradually, the onslaught of the pack's collective presence softened into a rhythm she could manage. She felt Kieran's heart beating in tandem with hers, a harmony that transcended words. The chanting soared to a crescendo. She sensed a burst of warmth flood her veins, as though the moon's glow had melted into her bloodstream. At that moment, she opened her eyes and met Kieran's gaze. For a split second, the world fell away, leaving only the two of them, entwined by the primal force that shaped werewolves and had now reached out to claim her as one of their own human, yet bound by choice and love. Suddenly, a savage howl tore through the night. The chanting faltered, replaced by alarmed cries. The circle broke as wolves spun toward the tree line, where shapes emerged in the flickering torchlight. Mira's heart plummeted. Rowan's pack had come, lunging from the shadows with snarling jaws and gleaming eyes. Bryce and Amara instantly roared commands, leading a contingent of the pack to intercept the intruders. Chaos erupted. Wolves clashed in midair, torches toppled, sparks dancing amid the confusion. Kieran released Mira's hands, body tensing. He half-shifted in an instant, claws and fangs sliding into existence. "Stay behind me," he growled, scanning for the greatest threat. Then a familiar presence emerged from the darkness, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a cruel twist to his lips. His eyes glowed unnaturally, and he held himself with the arrogant confidence of an alpha unafraid of trespassing on another's territory. Rowan. The rival alpha surveyed the turmoil with a triumphant sneer. "So this is the grand ceremony," he said, voice laced with derision. "How touching. A human as your mate? How far the lunar eclipse pack has fallen." A furious snarl ripped from Kieran's throat. "This ends now, Rowan. You trespass on sacred ground." Rowan's grin widened, revealing unnervingly sharp canines. "Sacred? Perhaps once. Now it's just another battleground." He shifted his gaze to Mira, his stare predatory. "So you're the human who has the mighty Kieran enthralled. Pathetic, but useful. I bet if I take you, his precious ceremony falls apart." Cold fear slithered down Mira's spine. She stepped closer to Kieran, feeling his protective rage throb through the bond. "Stay away from her," Kieran snarled, half-shifted face contorted with lethal intent. Rowan laughed, a cruel sound. "Then come and stop me." He lunged, shifting mid-leap into a monstrous wolf form. Kieran met him head-on with a clash that reverberated through the clearing. Fur, claws, and teeth tore at each other in a savage dance of power. The pack scattered to give them space, while the rest of Rowan's wolves fought viciously with the defenders. Mira found herself caught in the maelstrom. She dodged a snapping wolf lunging past, brandishing the basic self-defense moves Amara had taught her just to keep from being bowled over. All around her, the ceremony site was a chaos of howls, shouts, and swirling smoke from toppled torches. She saw Bryce, partially shifted, wrestling two of Rowan's wolves away from a wounded elder. Amara slashed at another attacker, cutting it off from the circle. Her mind reeled with fear, but also with a surging determination not to let Rowan destroy everything. Kieran and Roland crashed into a nearby tree, splintering bark. Rowan's wolf form dwarfed Kieran's, his fur a dark russet, his eyes glowing with malevolence. But Kieran fought with desperate fury, refusing to yield an inch. Their snarls were almost inhuman in their intensity. Suddenly, Mira felt a presence at her back. She whirled, raising her arms defensively. A snaring wolf in human form reached for her, grabbing at her tunic. She twisted, remembering Amara's instructions, and stomped on his foot while delivering an elbow strike to his rib cage. He let out a grunt, loosening his grip just enough for her to slip away, but he growled and came at her again, teeth bared. In the next instant, a blur of movement intercepted him. Kaliana, eyes blazing gold, slammed into the attacker with surprising strength for an elder. She snarled, driving him back, then glanced at Mira. "Go. Get to safety." But Kieran, Mira gasped, glancing at the raging fight between the alphas. "I'll hold him off," Kaliana insisted, turning to block another foe. "You mustn't get taken." Mira hesitated. Part of her wanted to retreat, but another part refused to abandon Kieran. Their bond crackled in her veins, urging her to stand firm. Even from across the clearing, she sensed Kieran's agony as Rowan raked claws down his flank. The tie they shared echoed his pain like a distant thunderclap. With a surge of adrenaline, she broke into a run, weaving through the chaos, ignoring the danger. She had to reach him. Meanwhile, Rowan pinned Kieran against a shattered log, jaws snapping dangerously close. Blood matted Kieran's fur, and he struggled, one hind leg braced against Rowan's chest. With a desperate twist, he managed to roll free, but Rowan lunged again, slamming him to the ground. A low whimper escaped Kieran, and Mira's heart seized. She rushed forward, shouting, though her voice drowned in the din. Just as Rowan reared back, preparing for a killing bite, Mira picked up a broken torch from the ground, embers still smoldering at one end. She hurled it at Rowan's wolf form, aiming for his face. It struck him across the muzzle, sending a burst of sparks. Rowan snarled in surprise, stumbling backward. The distraction gave Kieran a moment to lurch upright, coughing. "Mira, get back!" Kieran rasped, blood staining his muzzle. She ignored him, eyes flashing. "I won't leave you," she shouted, brandishing the torch stub like a weapon. Rowan rounded on her, lips curled back in a feral snarl. The hatred in his eyes sent a bolt of terror through her, but she stood firm, refusing to cower. Her heart thumped painfully, adrenaline flooding every nerve. If she faltered, Rowan could strike them both down. Then, with a chilling growl, Rowan shifted back to human form still, unnaturally fast and strong. His clothes hung in tattered shreds, and his chest was slick with sweat and blood. He eyed Mira with an almost gleeful malice. "Your bravery is admirable," he spat, "but this is a wolf's fight. You have no place here." He lunged at her. She tried to dodge, but he moved too fast. His hand closed around her wrist, twisting it painfully until she dropped the torch. A cry escaped her throat as he yanked her close, his breath hot against her ear. "I'll make an example of you," he hissed. "Then take your precious Alpha's territory." Before he could tighten his hold, Kieran threw himself at Rowan, knocking him off balance. The three of them tumbled to the ground in a tangle of limbs. Mira struggled free, gasping, while Kieran shifted back to partial form, hooking an arm around Rowan's neck. Rowan twisted, smashing an elbow into Kieran's injured side. The cry of pain from Kieran reverberated in Mira's chest through that bond. With a roar of fury, Mira grabbed a fallen branch and slammed it against Rowan's side. He let out a startled grunt, releasing Kieran momentarily. Kieran seized the opening, hooking his leg around Rowan's, toppling him. In a swift motion, Kieran locked Rowan's arm, twisting until the rival Alpha gasped in pain. Blood dripped from Kieran's forehead, his eyes burning with lethal intent. "This ends," Kieran snarled. "Call off your wolves or I'll—" Rowan's lips peeled back in a sneer. "You'll what? Kill me? Your precious traditions forbid it during the rite." Kieran hesitated, conflict raging in his eyes. Wolves rarely slaughtered each other during such a sacred night. There were old laws about shedding alpha blood under the blood moon. But Rowan's challenge was savage, and the pack's survival hung in the balance. Mira's chest tightened. If Kieran showed mercy, Rowan might strike again at the first chance. Yet if Kieran killed Rowan, it would violate the ancient code, risking the pack standing among neighboring wolf communities. In that heartbeat of indecision, Rowan jerked free, striking Kieran's wounded flank. Kieran's agonized cry tore at Mira's heart. Rowan leaped up, chest heaving, as if to finish Kieran off. But an explosion of snarls erupted behind him. Bryce, Amara, and half a dozen pack members stormed forward, forcing Rowan to pivot in defense. Surrounded, Rowan let out a low growl, assessing the overwhelming odds. Realizing he was cornered, Rowan spat blood and glared at Mira, then at Kieran. "This isn't over," he vowed, voice dripping venom. With astonishing speed, he dashed to the side, slipping past the ring of defenders. His wolves, seeing their alpha retreat, pulled back as well, vanishing into the tree line like shadows. Within moments, the clearing was left with only the lunar eclipse pack, panting and battered, the triumphant for the moment. Mira dropped to her knees beside Kieran, who had collapsed onto all fours, partially shifted features trembling with pain. Blood oozed from multiple gashes, staining the ground. "Kieran," she whispered, heart in her throat. She touched his shoulder, feeling him quiver. "Stay with me. We're safe now." He let out a ragged breath, shifting back to human form, though the effort seemed to cost him dearly. His skin glistened with sweat, wounds still bleeding. "I'm fine," he managed, lips twisting in a grimace. "Just help me up." She braced her arm under his, supporting him as Bryce and Amara rushed over. The pack gathered around, wearing expressions of both relief and concern. Some were wounded, but they'd fended off Rowan's assault before he could disrupt the ceremony completely. Safia approached, staff in hand, her face etched with worry. "The rite was interrupted," she murmured. "Do the transference complete?" Mira closed her eyes, still feeling the residual tingle of supernatural energy in her veins. "I'm not entirely sure," she admitted shakily. "I felt something, but then Rowan attacked." Safia and Kaliana exchanged glances. "We can sense a bond more stable than before," Kaliana said, voice subdued. "But it might not be fully sealed without the final invocation." A wave of despair washed over Mira. They'd come so close, only to be thrown into chaos. If the rite remained incomplete, the pack might not gain the unity they needed to fully resist Rowan's ongoing menace. "What do we do?" she whispered. Kaliana glanced at the moon, which was still high but past its zenith. "We have a short window left. The blood moon's power fades before dawn. If you can stand, if Kieran can stand, we might still finish what was started." Every muscle in Mira's body screamed for rest, every nerve frayed by fear and violence. But she looked at Kieran's ashen face, at the battered warriors around them, and knew there was no other choice. Slowly, she helped him back to the center of the clearing, where the shattered remains of the ceremonial circle lay. Pack members relit the fallen torches, replacing them around the perimeter. The chanting resumed, halting at first, then swelling with renewed determination. Kieran leaned on Mira, his weight a reminder of how badly he was hurt. Yet as the chanting rose again, she felt the bond between them flare to life, bridging the physical pain with a raw, unbreakable connection. Kaliana raised her arms, urging the pack to focus, The drumming resumed in a steady tempo, matching the frantic beat of Mira's heart. "Mira, Kieran, speak your final vow," Sophia called, staff lifted skyward. Kieran's voice was faint, but resolute. "I, Kieran, Alpha of the Lunar Eclipse Pack, pledge my life and leadership to Mira, accepting her as my Luna, bound by fate and by choice, in the sight of the blood moon and the pack." Her throat felt tight, tears burning at the corners of her eyes. Summoning the last of her strength, she replied, "I, Mira Carter, pledge my heart and loyalty to Kieran and the Lunar Eclipse Pack, accepting my role as Luna, by the power of this moon and the bond we share." In that instant, the collective will of the pack surged, funneling energy into the battered clearing. The torches flared brighter, and the red glow of the moon seemed to intensify, bathing the entire scene in a crimson luminescence. A wave of heat washed over Mira, far stronger than before. It coursed through her link with Kieran, wrapping around her soul with the force of a tidal wave. She cried out, not in pain but in awe, as she felt the pack's presence settle like an invisible mantle on her shoulders. Kieran squeezed her hand, his wounds still bleeding, yet she felt his spirit rallying. In that moment, the transference completed. She sensed the pack's acceptance, a wave of belonging that resonated through every cell of her body. Through the dizziness of revelation, she realized she was no longer just Mira Carter, the human outsider. She was tied to them all now, her soul woven into the Lunar Eclipse Pack's tapestry. Slowly, the chanting subsided, the drum beats faded. A hush settled over the clearing. Kaliana lowered her arms, a glimmer of respect in her eyes. "It is done," she declared, voice resonating with finality. "Mira is Luna. The bond stands." A ripple of relief and awe passed through the gathered wolves. Some bowed their heads, others let out ragged cheers. Bryce and Amara exchanged glances of satisfaction, while the wounded were helped to their fate, if they could stand. Kieran sagged against Mira, breathing hard, but a faint smile curved his bloodied lips. "We did it," he whispered, voice raw. She cradled him, tears streaking her face. "Yes," she managed, her heart pounding with a heady mix of triumph and concern for his injuries. "We did." Pack members hurried to tend the wounded, including Kieran, but not before a wave of them came forward to acknowledge her as their new Luna. She received solemn nods and murmured words of welcome, even from those who had once doubted her. The acceptance she felt was almost overwhelming. Despite the blood, the bruises, and the half-burned torches, there was a palpable sense of hope in the air, like new growth after a raging fire. Eventually, with the moon still glowing in its ruby splendor, she and Kieran were taken inside to be treated. As healers fussed over his gashes and bruises, Mira sat close, holding his hand, refusing to leave his side. She felt drained to the core, yet alive in a way she never had before. The pack's presence hummed at the edge of her consciousness, comforting, strong, and welcoming. She realized with a rush of gratitude that she wasn't alone anymore. She was bound to them, and they to her. Rowan might still lurk beyond the borders, licking his wounds and plotting his next move. The future might be fraught with challenges, old enemies, new perils. But tonight, under the witness of the blood moon, Mira had embraced a destiny she never anticipated. She had chosen to stand with Kieran, to face a world of claws and fangs, to find her place in a realm where loyalty ran deeper than blood. And for the first time in her life, she truly understood the quiet power of belonging, of love, forged in the crucible of fear, sealed by a vow that transcended human and wolf alike. As she watched Kieran drift into an exhausted sleep, his hand still entwined with hers, she brushed back a strand of his dark hair and pressed a gentle kiss to his temple. A quiet conviction settled in her heart. They would endure together. Bound by heart and moonlit vows, they would lead the lunar eclipse pack into whatever dawn came next, defying old prejudices and forging a future all their own. Outside, the blood moon began its slow descent, painting the sky in soft shades of crimson and gold. And though Mira's eyes were heavy, she gazed through the window, a small smile on her lips. She felt the bond thrum in her chest, a living thing that promised strength, unity, and love. She might be human, and he might be an alpha werewolf, but together they had woven a story as timeless as the moon itself, and now they would walk forward, side by side, beneath the stars of a brand new night.